morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. My name is Karen Peterson. I'm the Director of Education and Public Programs here at Shelburne Museum, and we are delighted to welcome you to a sweet symposium in celebration and exploration of our new temporary exhibition, Sweet Tooth, The Art of Dessert. I think we're in for a really interesting day of discussion, conversation, and exploration on topics that I think are near and dear to all of our hearts and other parts of our body, sugar and chocolate. Last night, my husband and I went out to dinner at a local eatery. Some of you will know it well. And for dessert, we had Cheryl's chocolate pie. Corey is nodding his head because he knows what I'm talking about. So here is this fabulous dessert covered in meringue whipped cream with chocolate shavings. I think it was sort of semi-sweet, and a chocolate mousse and a dark chocolate cookie crumb and crunchy, like it must have been like turbinado sugar crystals in the crust, and it was really fabulous. And then I realized I'm eating our symposium this morning. So it was both great and a reminder that we had this to look forward to. Today, we will be exploring the topics of sugar in the morning and chocolate in the afternoon. Before you have packets of information that contain a schedule of the day's events, bios of our esteemed speakers, a bibliography to read more about it after today, and some various museum publications if you're not familiar with the museum. And as well in that packet, there is a survey. So I'll remind you later in the day, but at the conclusion of the day, if you would be so kind as to complete that survey, that will really help us in planning for future events such as this. I wanted to remind you of one thing. Cell phones, if you could silence those or turn them off or put them on vibrate or whatever it is you want to do, it's just so, and I'm going to do the same so I don't forget. But that way we can have an undisturbed morning of conversation, and it won't be picked up or recorded on RETN, the Regional Education Television Network, that is so kind and is here to film this conversation and symposium as it has our previous symposiums, and so this will be available on their website and on local television in the near future. I would like to start the day by introducing our curator, Corey Rogers, who was involved in Sweet Tooth, The Art of Dessert. And Corey will help us kick off the day. Corey Rogers received his BA in Art History from the University of Oklahoma in 2000 and his MFA in Decorative Arts History from the Smithsonian Associates Parsons School of Design Master's Program in the History of American Decorative Arts in 2003. He started at Shelburne Museum as an intern in 2004, and I was working here when he did, and has worked his way up to his current position as curator. During his tenure at the museum, Corey has organized over 20 exhibitions, ranging from motorcycles to most recently the reinterpretation and reinstallation of our wildfowl decoy collection in Dorset House. Perhaps at lunchtime you'll get a chance to slip down the hill and see that. Corey brings a breadth of experience to his work and a cheekiness and sense of humor that helps us all realize that we don't have to always be too seriously academic in the work that we do. So it is my pleasure to introduce Corey Rogers, who will lay out the day for us. Thank you.
The reason I was shaking my head so vigorously when Karen was talking about Cheryl's chocolate pie is because I love it so much. Every time I go to that establishment and I eat it, in between forkfuls, as I'm spooning it into my mouth, I recite the various ways that I love that chocolate pie. And my partner gets really annoyed with me, so he usually makes me take it to go. Thank you all for coming. Karen, thank you, and your staff. I want to thank Samantha Bellinger for putting this symposium together, Chloe Vogt, her assistant. I wanted to thank our roster of all-star speakers today. Your work has been very instrumental in the research that we conducted for Sweet Tooth. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank our sponsor, Lake Champlain Chocolate. They have been very generous in supporting the exhibition, both monetarily and in kind with chocolate, and we're very appreciative. This exhibition really started out as, the idea of it started out, I was thinking about a show called Food for Thought, and I wanted to talk about food and advocacy and the way that art and design are being used to promote these ideas. And then I got distracted, as I often do, and I started thinking about the fork. And I wanted to do a whole exhibition on the fork. And then my brilliant assistant curator, Carolyn Bauer, out there, and I decided that may be too specific. And a niche area for people. So she and I came up with this idea of looking at sweets and desserts. And it's a natural fit for the institution when you think about the founding of Shelburne Museum. Electra Havemeyer-Webb, our founder, she was the daughter of H.O. Havemeyer, who basically ran a monopoly on sugar in the late 19th and early part of the 20th century. He was variously known as the Sugar King and as the Sugar Pope. We have an amazing illustration in our collection that shows him alongside other kind of robber barons and their various guises of their the sources of their largesse. And they have H.O. With the cone-shaped sugar outfit, and he's the Sugar Pope. And it's just, I wanted to include that in the show, but we decided not to. The family, by the way, was all excited about it, and they have a very good sense of humor about these things. So we wanted to think about sugar in terms of the founding of our institution, but also the way sugar affects not only our culture, but our waistlines. And so we organized this exhibition in a way that audiences come into it with their own perspectives, and they can encounter the works in the way that they choose to. If you come in and you just want to see pretty poppy pictures of candy or cake, or if you want to take the time and you want to delve into the little labels, you get to read a little bit further into kind of the social issues that surround sugar and chocolate. So the exhibitions like these are only able to provide our audiences with just a morsel, a sampling, really, of the intellectual content that surrounds these subjects. And so that's why I enjoy and appreciate events like this that allow our audiences to take a bigger bite and really kind of explore the subject for themselves and listen to experts in their own right. So the way that things are going to go today is that I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then once the speakers are done, we'll have a little bit of a Q&A period where people can ask them questions, and we'll just move on periodically that way. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce our first speaker, whose work was very important in the research of this exhibition. Andrew F. Smith is the author or editor of 32 books and encyclopedias, including the award-winning Oxford Encyclopedia of Food and Drink in America, Sugar, A Global History, and the 3-volume Food in America. He teaches in the Food Studies Department at the New School in Manhattan, my alma mater, and is the editor of the Edible Series and Food Controversies series for Reaction, books in London. He has been regularly interviewed on radio and television, including National Public Radio, the History Channel, and lost my place, and the Food Network. He has served as a historical consultant to several television series, including PBS What We Eat, and History Detectives, and Food Network's Heavyweights, the History Channel's America Eats, Discoveries, How Stuff is Made, and the National Geographic Channel's 6-episode miniseries, Eat, the Story of Food. I don't know how you can conduct that much research and be as thin as he is. Andrew, please, I'll give you the podium.
I wanted to go to the dark side, but I guess I can't now. In any case, I got this grant, and I put a chocolate bar with almonds in it in the middle of a map of the world, and I put on it a little off to the side some teacher advice, or kids could go up on their own and take a look at this. We had little lines going from places to places and say, where does chocolate come from? And I had a little line, in this case, from the chocolate bar all the way to West Africa, and where does sugar come from? And I had this going to, at that time, Cuba. It changed later on, but all sorts of different places in the world, and I enjoyed putting that together very much. It was probably one of the most successful things that I ever did. UNICEF loved it, and they published it in 15, 20 different languages, and it went up in school around the world on the wall. So I thought that was an interesting sort of thing to do. The Swedes bitterly complained that I was promoting junk food, a topic which I had never heard prior to that time. So it shows you my own ignorance on this. They decided they would use the idea. They put a bicycle down there, and they said, well, where does rubber come from, and where does steel come from? A lot of it comes from Sweden, by the way. I thought I'd point this out. And so you had these interconnections that were going on. Because that was successful, I was invited to 10 conferences, and usually it was for a lunch or for a dinner, and they would say, could you now do the food thing for us? And so I became the food person, even though it was not my academic background and not a particular strength that I had. And I started looking at this and saying, okay, this was interesting. I could talk to adults about virtually anything that I wanted to talk about as long as I got their attention. So if I wanted to talk about politics, I could talk about food. If I wanted to talk about economics, I could talk about food. If I wanted to get them interested in social and cultural matters, I could talk about food. And in my case, I loved history. Anybody not love history in here? Not love history? Corey, okay, no, all right, no problem in this case. I decided that if you took a look at sugar's history, in this case, sucrose, you would have a history of the world. And so I began to write a 3-volume work on the history of sugar. And it starts off in New Guinea, goes from New Guinea to Southeast Asia, from Southeast Asia to South Asia, and that would be book 1. And book 2 would be how sugar introduced into the Mediterranean through the Middle East, and that would be book 2. And then book 3 would be from 16th century on, food, in this case, sugar in the Atlantic and in the New World. And I said, that's what I'm going to be working on. And I did that for 3 or 4 years. I don't know if Wendy, we met during that period of my life or not, but it was close in there when I was doing research at different places. And in the midst of this, Sid Mintz came out with the book Sweetness and Power. It is one of the books that's on your list. It's by far one of the best books, not in that case, excluding Wendy's book, which is better. So in this case, Sid Mintz's book came out, and I said, well, no publisher is going to take on a 3-volume work from an unknown person at that time who was writing a history of the world using sugar as a vehicle for this. So I would put aside my interest in sugar and work on other things. And that's how I got interested in food and started writing books on it and started teaching subjects related to that. But then I got around to the point of saying I had collected so much material, I wanted to write a book on sugar, and consequently, I'm going to run off. This is one of the shortest books I've ever written. So I just want you to know, 3 volumes down to about 15, 20,000 words, and that's the end of this. So I'm still in love with the subject, and I may take it on in a more important topic later on. Now, there are all sorts of sweeteners, and humankind has done everything they possibly can to get sweetness out of everything. And that includes, obviously, fruits. That includes vegetables. How many of you like carrots? Anybody carrots in here? Carrots are initially extremely bitter. It is only after hundreds of years of work with carrots that they, in fact, became sweet. How many of you are into insect products? Do we have anybody in here interested in? We only have one person interested. None of you are interested in honey? I'm shocked. So we've harvested the bee in order to produce sweetness. And we've harvested all sorts of other products and plants and saps from trees. Anybody into tree sap in here? I knew in Vermont I would get a hands up on that. There actually are many trees that have sweet saps at different times of the year, and only at certain times of the year does that sweetness make sense. And obviously maple around here is one of those things that has been used as sweetener. So we have all sorts of sweeteners. And there's a pretty good reason for that. And the obvious reason is glucose. How many of you are into glucose? Any of you have some glucose on you? Glucose is the energy for your body. Without glucose, you're dead. By the way, your brain is the #1 need for the glucose. It consumes about 20 to 25% of the total glucose that you consume, in fact, goes into your brain. If your brain or any part of your brain does not have access to glucose for a matter of minutes, it dies. So consequently, glucose is crucial. No glucose, there is no life, at least not human life. And so consequently, it's something important. Lactose, by the way, is the 40% of breast milk, and that's one of the reasons on why that is. So there's a good reason on why humans need sweetness and why we have done everything we possibly can for the last several thousand years to figure out better ways of getting sweeter products. So that's part of this interesting thing. Now, from a natural standpoint, the one plant with the largest amount of sugar in it happens to be sucrose. Sucrose is also, you have some right back here, what is it also called? Table sugar. How many of you have had table sugar? All right, table sugar is sucrose. It consists of 50% glucose and 50% fructose. Fructose is easily metabolized by the body into glucose, but it is much sweeter than glucose is, and so consequently, that combination is what has interested humans for a long time. At least 10,000 years ago, there are people in New Guinea that decided that the sugar cane, in this case, what we'll call Creole sugar, is something that they want to tap into, and they have been, for at least several thousand years, they have been cultivating cane sugar in order to produce it. Cane sugar will not grow on its own. It will, if you just leave it out in the wild, it will die out. It needs humans to interact with it in order to plant it. It cannot be grown by its own, like corn, by the way. Corn cannot be grown without humans. So you have all sorts of things that have happened that make this something that is an important part of this. Now, here's the problem. As soon as have any of you been to Southeast Asia or South Asia and had some sugar cane cut up? You can get it, it's on the street, they sell it. And you usually chaw on it, or you can squeeze it out and get the juice out. Now, there's a problem with the juice of the sugar cane. As soon as you squeeze it out, what do you think is going to happen? How about fermentation? Is this something, if anyone interested in fermentation in here? Sugar cane is about 16 or 17% sugar, but it has a lot of impurities in it. As soon as you squeeze it out, it will begin to ferment, which is great if you want alcohol, but it's not great if you want to preserve the sweetness that is in there. So consequently, you have to figure out a way how to convert that juice that comes out into a solid product. We don't know for sure who first did that. The best evidence is people in India industrialized the process of making sugar, in this case, solid sugar out of cane sugar, and so cane sap. So in this case, you had a process of going on. Now, it's not like the granulated sugar. The granulated sugar that we know and love is a product of the 19th century. Prior to this time, it would have been extremely solid. You would have poured it into a mold when you got it down there, and typically it came in a cone shape, and so if you were wealthy enough to be able to afford some of the sugar, you would come along and scrape it off. Now, it would not have been white. White sugar is also a creation of the 19th century because it would have had impurities in it. It would have been gray or had other colors in it besides simply the white that we know and love in our sugar cane. So consequently, this becomes an important product in India. Once you solidify it, then you can trade it. You can't trade the juice, but you can trade the hard product. And so from India, it goes, the sugar trade will go into China. China will begin to adopt sugar cane, at least in south part of China. You will begin to have early records of Chinese consuming sugar. There are sugar places that you can actually buy sugar in China by the 12th century, etc. So it becomes an important product there. The Greeks and Romans were familiar with sugar. They called it the reed that made honey, and consequently, it is the Greeks and the Romans that will do some importation of sugar into the Mediterranean in ancient times. Now, here's the problem. There's not a lot of it, and why would Romans want sugar besides the fact that they might have liked the taste of it? It's an important part of it's medicinal. It's an important part of medicine. How many of you know Mary Poppins? A little bit of sugar helps the medicine go down. Can we all sing this for a little while here? All right, and that's exactly the way it was used, because many of the medicines of from the last 1,500 years were in fact bitter, you would then put a little sugar to it, so it made it much easier for people to consume. So at least from about the 1st century all the way through the 15th century, this was an important use for the sugar that we would have had made during this time. So sugar goes from India into first the Middle East. It is Egypt that is a major sugar producer. It goes from the Middle East into the Mediterranean, particularly for the islands in the Mediterranean will become extremely important sugar producers. Sicily is an important sugar producer. Anybody been to Sicily? We have a couple people with their hands up. It is not what you think of as the agricultural center of the world today, mainly because of sugar. Cane industry destroyed the land that was historically a rich agricultural area, and it did the same thing to many of the islands. Now, one of the reasons on the Mediterranean that was extremely important was the rise of a single city called Venice. Anybody been to Venice? You got to go to Venice if you haven't been there. Venice reason on why it will rise in power is because of the sugar industry. It will control the islands, many of the islands that are in the Mediterranean. It will take in all the sugar, it will convert the sugar into a refined product, and from Venice it will go into the rest of Europe. Now there's a problem if you're on the western end of Europe, and that is you can see the sugar, you can see who gets rich, it's the Venetians, you can see who gets poor, and that's those in France, England, and in Northern Europe. And so those areas decide there must be a better way to get sugar other than buying it from the Venetians. And so one of the things that they begin to do is explore the Atlantic islands. In this case, the Canary Islands, the Azores, etc. And they conclude that these are really good places to grow sugar. By the way, sugar cane is not particularly a product that is successful in the Mediterranean, and the reason is it's if you have one cold spell, the sugar will die or will stop producing, and so consequently it's not perfect. But the islands in the Atlantic are better, but there's a problem. Nobody on those islands wants to engage in sugar production. Anybody in here interested in sugar production? This has been a problem with sugar production for at least the last 2,000 years. Nobody wants to do this. And so you use slaves for this. Now, initially, by the way, the slaves are not from Africa. The slaves, in fact, you go to war. You don't go to war to conquer territory. You go to war to conquer people. You bring the people back in as slaves, and therefore they're the ones that will engage in this industry. So that's the problem you have from the beginning, slavery introduced into the sugar trade. So when you go into the Atlantic islands, you need to import slaves. In this case, most of the slaves will be imported from West Africa. So, and as Christopher Columbus, by the way, he marries a woman from one of the islands in the Atlantic. Her father just happens to be a governor of the island, which is a major sugar producer. When he takes his second trip to the New World, he will bring sugar cane with him and will introduce it into what is today Haiti. So you have this introduction from the islands into the Caribbean. And it takes off at this point in the Caribbean and in Brazil. So you've got major production of sugar going on, and now you have new producers for sugar, and that's it. Now, sugar is not just associated with slavery. It is also associated with wealth. If you had wealth, you demonstrated it. How would you demonstrate your wealth with sugar? I'm sorry? Well, we'll talk about chocolate in a second. We haven't got the chocolate yet, but we will get there. All right, anybody else? How would you demonstrate your wealth? Well, you can serve it, okay, but why not make some sculptures out of it? How many want to make some sculptures with your sugar? You're laughing. For at least 2,000 years, people have made sculptures from sugar. And so it is a way, you just pour it into your mold. Rather than coming out a cone, you will come out with, and they're literally, some of the feasts in the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of these molds. And then as the guests would leave, you would give them one of these sculptures, or if you wanted to use it, you would, of course, scrape it off and you could use it as well. So this is how you demonstrated your wealth. If indeed you had sugar and you had sugar cane, this was one of the ways that you could demonstrate how powerful you were, how wealthy you were, that you could give this most important and expensive product away. So that's one of the things that you could do with sugar in order to demonstrate the position that you had within your society. Now, as sugar cane increased in terms of places, then you had refining issues. And refining sugar is not an easy thing. One of the things that's left over in the early process of refining sugar, anyone know the product that is not used, was totally used, it was tossed out to begin with? It's called molasses. Anybody ever hear of molasses? Now today, by the way, I just want you to know, most of the molasses, they make refined sugar to begin with, and then they convert it into molasses, as opposed to trying to have this as a product that they use for other purposes. So for most of the sugar industry in the Caribbean, you had this junk left over, which is all that excess stuff that you just typically dumped into the ocean. Americans had a good alternative use for this. Anybody know what you could do with molasses? Yes? Well, the first thing is you can use it as a sweetener, and at least for colonial times, it would have been what most Americans would have used. They would have used molasses as a sweetener because they would not have been able to afford pure sugar. But the second thing they could do with it, they could make rum. Now, here's part of the problem. You have British islands in the Caribbean, and you have French and you have Dutch islands in the Caribbean. They're all making sugar. The French don't want molasses introduced into France. Why wouldn't they want molasses introduced into France? There's a brandy industry in France which says we don't want molasses introduced because we don't want rum in France. And as far as I could tell, rum was not a product that was made in France until relatively recently. So you had control of this industry that's going on, and you had the brandy industry that was coming along. So these poor French islands in the Caribbean have a lot of junk left over. What are you going to do with it? You could throw it away, or you could sell it to the Americans. How many of you think selling it to the Americans would be a good idea? The British didn't like this idea of buying this molasses product because they believed in mercantilism, and mercantilism meant you traded everything through England. You didn't go to French colonies and pick the stuff up. And so in the 1730s, they passed the Molasses Act, which taxed buying molasses from French or non-British islands. Anybody ever hear of taxation without representation? No one in America cared about taxation and representation in the 1730s, and the reason was twofold. First, the British did not enforce it, and so therefore there was a great deal of smuggling going on. I know this will shock you, but some of those who signed the Declaration of Independence just happened to be smugglers of molasses coming in. And if there's no enforcement going on, all you got to do is, even if you want to import it directly, say, into Boston, then all you really had to do is pay off the guy who was coming in or keep him friends. And so lots of ways of getting about this. You have the French and Indian War that comes along in the 1760s. It is the British that win. And so the French are now kicked out of North America. There is no longer French Canada. It's now occupied by England. And there's no longer what is now those areas that is west of the Alleghenies, no longer controlled by the French and the Indians, but now are British territory. The British think that the Americans should help pay the cost of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War in America. And they think that Americans should help pay the cost of garrisoning this base because you got to control the Indians. Is that a good idea? So they decide they're going to pass the Sugar Act, and the Sugar Act is what they can going to tax Americans, but this time, unlike the Molasses Act, they're going to enforce it. So they send the British fleet over to America to make sure the smuggling stops. How many of you think this is a good idea? Those in Boston did not think this is a good idea, and where they did not complain about the Molasses Act and the tax, they now complained about the sugar tax, and there is where you ended up with no taxation without representation, and the American Revolution will be an end product of this coming along. So we can talk at length about that if you want, but that's part of this. Now, it just so happens the Americans win the revolution. Is this a surprise? The Green Mountain Boys did something with that. In Ticonderoga, I don't know. There's a German by the name of Wilhelm Havemeyer. Wilhelm is an immigrant. He goes into London. He's now become William. Does that sound like a good idea? And he is apprenticed to a sugar refinery in London. He decides that London's not the place for him, that the real place for him is New York City. Anybody from New York City in here besides? There's two of us, okay, three of us, okay. He then travels to New York City. He becomes a manager for a sugar refinery that is there. He then moves from the sugar refinery. He, with his other family members who have immigrated in, he will open up his own for refinery itself. By the 1840s, he will have the largest technological sugar refinery in the world that is constructed in Williamsburg, and the remains of it are still there. And I think the Domino sugar, the sign at least, is still up there. So this is an important part. Now, I mentioned slavery to begin with. along came a man by the name of Adam Smith. He's not a relative. Anybody know Adam Smith? He wrote a book, the short title of which is The Wealth of Nations. He publishes this in 1776. It is the beginning of capitalism, the end of mercantilism, and his capitalist view is as follows. Slavery is not just morally reprehensible, slavery is wrong because it's inefficient. And if you get rid of slavery, you will improve your technology, and the technology will make it so that slavery is unnecessary. And indeed, as the British end slavery in the 1830s, that is exactly what happens in the Caribbean. So you move from first a slave-based system into a worker-based system, and from a worker-based system, everyone sits down and says, how can we improve technology so that we can increase the amount of sugar and decrease the cost? So the price of sugar decreases after slavery ends. Sugar industry expands, and you have, in fact, the cost of sugar decreases appreciably. So if the problem in the sugar price declines appreciably, you've got a real problem with the industry because you can't make any money if the cost goes down so far. So there's a good solution to this. And what's the solution? Let's form a sugar trust. Is that a good idea? In this way, we can buy up all of the sugar, we can control the price, and the control of sugar price, by the way, remains today. It is not just something of the 19th century, although it's controlled in different ways. So the problem is the cost of sugar is virtually nothing. And so what you pay for it, it really is supporting all of the people in industry and advertising and promotion and lots of other reasons in there. And the sugar trust will be, and I know I'll probably get this, I'll say this wrong, but Henry Osborne Havemeyer was the one who created the Sugar Trust in 1877, and at least for the next 50 years it will maintain the cost of sugar, and it does so indirectly after that period of time. He will have a granddaughter. The granddaughter is Electra Havemeyer Webb, who will create this institution here. And by the way, this is my first trip here. Is anybody else the first trip here to this? Just the out-of-towners. This is an incredible place. One of the places that the Havemeyers had was a beautiful home in Manhattan, and it has been reconstructed on the insides of it, and this next door to us, with much of their artworks that they had in it in Manhattan that they have been introduced over here. So I haven't been there yet. That's one of the things I want to do today, so that's on my list. So it's wonderful that that's the case. So we have this industry coming along. Now, sugar, as the price drops, it's added to everything. Everything that you can think of, sugar is in one form or another. How about French fry? Any of you like French fries in here? I like French fries. Anybody in here? If you go to McDonald's, it will have sugar on it. Why will it have sugar on it? And the answer is there's such a thing as the bliss point. Anybody into bliss points? Bliss points will be the point in which you will like the taste of something. So in this case, you add sugar and salt together, will give you a flavor that is better for your taste buds than anything else. So how about let's create some health foods. And the health food industry, like Kellogg's, for instance, sugar, and the cereal industry. Any of you into cereal in here? It's a health food. It's a way to help Americans become vegetarians. Any of you vegetarians, you're laughing at this. I'm not. This is serious. Get them off of eggs, get them off of bacon, get them off. I mean, breakfast used to be a big deal, and it would have all these things. So we're going to create a cereal, and the cereal, we're going to create its way to get around and convince Americans not to consume. By the way, typically in the real old days with the Kellogg Institute, it would have been consumed with water, not milk, and so they go commercial and they start making some money selling this vegetarian health food. Does that sound like a good idea? Now, there's a problem. A lot of kids don't like it, and so what's the solution? How about putting a little sugar on it to help the cereal go down? Is that something good idea? Okay, so we've got some sugar added to it. We've got a little sweetener added to it, and that's great. But if you add a little more, your sales increase more. Does that sound like a good idea now? And if we add a little more sugar, the sales increase even more. At one point in the 1950s, there was one cereal with 72% sugar. And some of the top-selling cereals today, they have decreased it, but the amount of sugar that was contained in them was in the 40s and 50%. So all I can do is say, the amount of sugar that goes into virtually every product, every processed product that you consume is there. Now, I know you didn't want me to talk at length about obesity, so I won't do it, other than to mention that there was a report that came out on Friday. Obesity in America has hit its highest point at 40% of the American population is now defined as obese. So, and it's not just sugar, but sugar is a major component of that, and so we all like it. Now, I personally don't like to call that fat. I just want you to know I call it energy storage. It's energy storage, in this case, is glucose that is ready to be used in case I do a little running or jogging. I want to have that energy stored up so I can use it. But that's one of the problems of a tremendous success story, and that's it. Now, we have a presentation on chocolate later on. Chocolate is I look forward to your presentation. I don't want to, I just give a couple brief comments on it. Chocolate is a New World product. It will be a product that is from Maya and Aztecs, and they will consume it as a froth. It will, just for your information, it typically would have had chili peppers in it. It may have had bee honey. The bees in the New World don't produce as much honey as the Italian bee, which we now have around us today. There is no, in North America, there are no sweeteners, there's no bees, there's nothing obvious as sweetener except for some saps and things like that. But in this case, they might have put it in there, and it would be consumed typically by the emperors of the Aztecs. And anyone know why they would consume it? It's an aphrodisiac. Does that sound like a good idea? Now, you're laughing at this. This is not something to laugh at. This notion of the relationship between sugar and chocolate and aphrodisiacs continue to our Valentine's Day. So you're laughing at this, but I can show you the advertising and the promotion. You can improve your love life by giving a little chocolate. Have I tried that? I've tried that. So all I can do is say there's massive ways of doing this. I can talk for hours on this subject. I loved writing this book. I will probably write more books on sugar and sweets, and I look forward to the other presentations. Is there time for questions or not? Okay, I'm more than willing. No questions? I can lecture more. I've got a couple hours, yeah. Yes? The cost of sugar, the price of sugar going down is improved technology. So the answer is it's a labor-intensive activity to begin with of planting the cane, of harvesting the cane, of processing the cane and converting it from juice into a solid. And if you improve the process of taking it down to begin with, so that there are now cane cutters that will come along and it's actually done mechanically, then you'll remove the need for labor, and if you reduce the amount of labor that's involved in that, you reduce the cost of the sugar. So that's it. It will be a while before all of that is technologically improved, but today it's a labor, labor has very little to do with the whole thing. So from the beginning of the planting until the harvesting, till the converting in, it's all done mechanically. And that's true not just of sugar, by the way, that's true of virtually all of our industrial agricultural system. We can all complain about it, but it is what has created a system which is the cheapest food in America. Anybody know how much Americans spent on food in 1900? 48% of their take-home pay was expended on food in 1900. Anyone know what Americans spend today? It's less than 10% of the amount of your take-home pay is spent on food. So part of the problem is that our devaluation of food, meaning when it's expensive, we treated it like royalty. And when it's not expensive, we tend to ignore it and throw it out. Somebody should write a good book on food waste. That's my next book. I thought I'd mention this. Okay. Another does that answer your question? If I don't answer your question, just tell me I didn't do it. All right. Anybody else? I go off on these tangents. Nothing? Yes, please.
How is sugar cane reproduced? And also, could you expand on how...
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the first part of the question.
How is sugar cane reproduced? Or is it maintained?
Yes.
And how does it desolate the environment, as you mentioned in Sicily?
Okay. Sugar cane is a bamboo-like product. During its growing season, it can typically grow 2 inches a day. It will It can be 2 to 4 inches around. It can grow 18 to 20 feet high under perfect climatic conditions. So that's it. As you look at the cane, you will see that there are nods. And as you go up it, there is a little eye in the middle of each nod. So there may be 10 or 15 nods that are there. In order to grow sugarcane, you have to chop off each of the things with a nod in the middle. You have to take that nod and you have to put the nod in the ground. If you do not, if the whole thing falls over, it will not reproduce. And so consequently, humans have to cut it up and have to, initially had to cut it up themselves and then put it in. Today it's all done mechanically, but that is exactly how you would grow it. Without that, and the same thing with corn. If you think your corn that you grow in your garden will grow again, all I could do is say, let your corn die, and see what happens. And the answer is, it may grow back for 1 season, it will not grow back for 2. And it has human interaction. Humans have interacted with agricultural world in order to create the products that we know, love, and consume. And it is these things that are absolutely necessary for a human involvement in order to create a product that is. And sugarcane has about 17% sweetener in it. It is the largest natural source of sugar plant, and so that is the high product. I don't mind talking about high fructose corn syrup. I don't mind talking about the other sugars. I focused on that for reasons. Yes, please?
Where does sugar beets come into this system?
Where does sugar what?
Beets. Sugar beets.
Oh, good question. There's a real problem if you're in Northern Europe, and that is sugarcane doesn't grow there. And if you're in Russia and Germany, you don't have easy access like France, Spain, Portugal, and England to the Atlantic. And so therefore, you're not going to want to buy sugar. Remember, mercantilism, if you buy sugar, you're going to have to give up gold or silver historically, and they didn't really want to do that. And so they started exploring other sources. And it is Napoleon. Everybody remembers Napoleon in here. He will say, there's a product, because those British have blockaded the French off and on from the 1780s through 1815, and they've cut off the sugar from these islands, and the French want sugar, and so therefore he starts investing in sugar cane production, sugar beet production, and sugar beets begin to become productive. Today, sugar beets are grown extensively in Northern Europe, where sugarcane can't grow, and they're grown extensively in the United States. It is, from a standpoint of economics, it is inefficient to grow sugar beets, meaning the following: it is more costly to grow sugar beets and produce sugar out of it than it is to grow cane. And so why do you have sugar beet production? And the answer is politics and tariffs and controls that are currently in our culinary system that prevent imports from coming in. If we did, in fact, ever really carry out NAFTA and gave Mexico total ability to import sugar, which it can do from the southern part of it, there would be no sugar industry in America. In Florida, there would be no sugar beet industry in the West, simply because of the low cost, of ease of making sugar in certain places, and the high cost of trying to make sugar in Florida, which is not ideal, or creating sugar beets in the West. So politics is the reason for that being surviving today. It has nothing to do with economics.
Andy, as a follow-up, so where is sugarcane grown today?
Oh, sugarcane, the largest sugarcane producer is Brazil, and that brings up issues which have been raised extensively by environmentalists. Obviously, you can grow sugarcane constantly in Brazil, and one way you do it is by removing the jungle, and vast tracts of Brazil have done that. Likewise, similar things have happened in Central America. Sugar is produced in the Caribbean, but not a lot today. It is also produced in India and can be produced in other countries, but the largest producer by far is Brazil. We have 2 questions. What happened?
You mentioned in Sicily that the agricultural lands were ruined by sugarcane. Is that?
Yes.
How does that happen?
It happens because if you grow a single product on land for years and years and years, it destroys the land so that it becomes unproductive. In this case, in Sicily and virtually all of the other Mediterranean islands where sugarcane was produced, what would happen is they kept growing it, they kept planting it, and then when you had rains that would come through, you began to have massive amounts of erosion. So Sicily's agriculture was destroyed by erosion, dealing with products like repeating the same product growing on the same land over and over again. So that is a major cause, and that's a concern today with the new lands that are being, you begin to have production there too, so it's a problem, yeah.
So what about stevia, which is now, sold as an alternative sweetener in health food stores?
There's a whole, there's a lot of different health issues that are related to stevia now. I just noticed that the new Coca-Cola Zero now has stevia in it, which was surprising to me. I don't particularly like the taste of it, but that's another matter. I mean, the goal is, what you want to do is create an alternative that will make you feel good because you tasted something that's sweet and at the same time doesn't make you fat. And so that's the product. By far the most important early product was saccharin. And saccharin was, the major producer was Monsanto. Anybody here ever hear of Monsanto? And Monsanto, I mean, the initial goal was simply to make it available to diabetics so that you could consume something that was sweet without having to consume sugar. And so it is only after World War II when concern in America moves to obesity and diabetes and with other potentially related health problems that you begin to look at alternatives. And so there's a number of alternatives that come in, of which stevia would be one later on. I have not looked at the latest research on that. I'm always worried that taking something that tells your body you're going to get a sweetener and then it doesn't arrive is something else. When you have 10,000 taste buds in your mouth, every single one has a sweet receptor. And it's instant that that sweet receptor fires off, it tells the brain, the exact same part of the brain, by the way, it's the reward center. None of you drink, I know, but if you did drink, that would be the reward center. None of you do drugs. If you did, that would be the reward center, and other things that we have. The reward center then tells the stomach that it's time now to eat and you need to become efficient. And so at least there's been some question about all of the sugar alternatives, whether or not it makes our bodies more efficient, so the food that you do consume along with it, it is more productive in terms of taking the calories out of that, breaking down carbohydrates into glucose, and the glucose is not, if it's not used, it will be stored, and that ends up as fat. So there are issues. I'm not up on the latest issue with that. There seems to be some positive statements about stevia too, so that's it.
So
Nobody mentioned high fructose corn syrup. Anybody into high fructose corn syrup? Anybody against high fructose corn syrup? Anybody not want to make a stand on high fructose corn syrup? We have one person who, are you favor or opposed?
I'm opposed.
Are you opposed? Okay. I will give my opinion and then I will leave quickly and get out of the room. Sucrose is 50% glucose and it is 50% fructose. That is what it is. The instant that it goes into your body, the glucose is separated from the fructose instantaneous, within a matter of not even a second. The glucose will enter your bloodstream immediately. The fructose will go and will be metabolized into glucose and will go in. So that is what sucrose is, and 50-50. High fructose corn syrup, by definition, must be less than 60% fructose, period. So most of the high fructose corn syrup is like 44% glucose and 56% fructose. The reason on why they do it, it's sweeter. So if you're making beverages, for instance, it will taste much sweeter than will sugar cane. So that's it. Would the high fructose corn syrup industry survive if there were total importation of sucrose from other countries or sugarcane from other countries? And the answer is no, because it costs more to produce it than it does to produce sugarcane in Brazil and import it into the United States. So the quick answer, from a health standpoint, in my humble opinion, there is no evidence that high fructose corn syrup is any worse than sucrose. Now I can see nobody wants to ask me any more questions.
Yeah. Well, perhaps after lunch, when people are recharged for the afternoon Q&A, you can think about your attitude towards fructose. Andy, thank you very much.
Our next speaker, Dr. Wendy Woloson, is an associate professor of history at Rutgers University, where she is also the advisor of History Club. She has her BFA from Iowa State University in 1986, her MFA from Montana State University in 1990, and her MA from Bowling Green State University in 1993, and her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1999. Dr. Woloson's area of research centers around America's popular culture, public history, and the U.S. economic history. It is my pleasure to present Dr. Wendy Woloson.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for being here, and I'd like to thank the Shelburne Museum for inviting me to speak today on the history of confectionery. Let me just get myself in order here. I'm really happy to be part of this program, and I'm especially grateful for getting a sneak preview of the exhibition this morning, which was a real treat, so to speak. All right, so the pieces in the Sweet Tooth exhibition are nothing if not highly charged, as you'll see. They play on ideas of luxury, beauty, frivolity, sexuality, and even decadence. But why did they so powerfully evoke these things, almost viscerally, on a visceral level? Even though these are wholly modern works of art, I think they're provocative because of the long history that we have with sugar and allied substances like chocolate, which I'm excited to hear about later this afternoon. Whether we realize it or not, much of the power of these works derives from the deep and abiding associations we have with sweetness as an experience and with sweets as material things. And so today I'd like to try to unpack some of this longer history to help place these pieces in a larger historical context that might help inform the way we look at these things. And I should also say I'm really grateful to be going after Andy because he laid a lot of the groundwork in terms of the production. Some things I'll amplify on, and I have illustrations of some of the very things that you were talking about. And I'm also happy that you laid that groundwork because I'm going to be talking more about consumption from, confections from the consumer's point of view. Okay. So we don't know the precise origins of sugarcane, as Andy suggested, but they're ancient, perhaps coming from China, New Guinea. The Philippines scholars aren't really in agreement about this. Northern Europeans' relationship with sugar began around AD 1000 when the Spanish began using it for medicinal purposes. The Crusades helped bring sugar to other European countries, and by AD 1200, Antwerp reigned as the refining center for sugar grown on Crete and Cyprus, and their commercial dominance was followed later by other thriving port cities such as London, Bristol, and Bordeaux. And again, I'm glad that you filled in some of this other more complex history, which is sort of beyond my wheelhouse in my talk this morning. At this time, and perhaps not surprisingly, we start to see sugar becoming an important status symbol, with powerful men commissioning sugar sculptures for important events. And I've got some nice pictures here of these things. Table-sized works made out of thousands of pounds of sugar appeared at post-Ramadan banquets and at the courts of England and France. This was especially impressive given that it would be centuries before even the very wealthy civilians could afford to consume sugar even by the spoonful. By the 1300s and 1400s, Spain and Portugal were experimenting with sugar production in their colonies, and it slowly began infiltrating elite households by this time. Columbus brought sugar to the New World from the Spanish colonies in 1493, and by 1520, Spain had introduced sugarcane to Mesoamerica, where it joined cacao for perhaps the first time, and hopefully we'll hear more about that this afternoon. Importantly, the Caribbean plantations owned by the Dutch, French, and British came to dominate sugar production by the 1600s, and this is where our story of modern sugar consumption really begins. In addition to global politics that pitted merchant empires against each other on the stage of global trade, there were other practical factors and constraints limiting the spread of sugar, again, which Andy touched on, you got into during the Q&A in particular. It's a fragile plant. Sugar cane, the source of refined sugar, is not easy to grow. It requires a painstaking propagation process that requires a lot of land. The plant requires a lot of constant watering and a long growing season, sometimes up to 12 months, in very tropical climates. And once grown, it requires back-breaking effort to harvest, especially in the age before mechanization. Large stalks could only be cut by hand using large machetes, and you can see in this, wait, I've got this laser pointer thing here. Here's some of these stalks, this, showing you this bamboo-like plant. And then there's the difficulty of extracting the juice. What do you do with this plant after you harvest it? Once grown and cultivated, the juice had to be extracted, at first by hand presses before steam-powered mechanization in the 1830s. And you can see some of these presses here, and here's some of this cane juice. And here's another one where you can see the sugar mill and then the juice coming out here. And then there's the refinement process itself, which also before steam power necessitated boiling sugar down in copper kettles over blazing heat, which you can see part of here, and that's what's going on here. So refining systematically removes the moisture and impurities from sugar. And the purer the sugar, the whiter it is, the more refined it is. And the more refined sugar is more versatile, both in terms of flavor and materially. So refined sugar you can actually do things with. You can mold it, you can shape it, you can pipe it. And it's also a more anonymous sweetener, so it's a more versatile flavoring agent. And we can see here different grades of sugar, from the very refined to the cruder versions. So scholars tend to think of sugar as a product of both agriculture and industry. So it's important to remember that raw cane is not a finished commodity, but requires much more labor and resources before it comes to market. So having the capital to invest in labor and machinery to do all this determined a colonizing country ability to supply its own domestic markets with sugar and export the rest for profit. And that brings us to yet another reason why sugar was so prized in the American colonies in particular, because only a small percentage of it at first was re-exported from the ports of Bristol and London to American shores. American consumption, in fact, lagged almost a century behind that of the British, simply because their collective sweet tooth was becoming insatiable by the early 18th century. They were eating almost all their supplies and saving very little for their colonial subjects. Basically, we had to wait in line for the sugar that they were producing, and they were eating almost all of it. Another essential thing to add here is that the voracious European appetite for sugar required an increasing body of labor to produce it. Again, something that Andy touched upon in the Q&A. The Dutch and British in particular used an exponentially growing number of enslaved people to cultivate and refine their sugar. So we can't understand the history of refined sugar or the confections made with it without acknowledging the essentialness of slavery and global trade to the process. No slaves, no sugar, no sweets. For all these reasons, refined sugar at first only trickled into American markets and diets, and it was highly prized. Even though still a rare commodity that many people would never taste in their entire lives, its associations with power, luxury, and even exoticism had already been firmly implanted in colonists' minds through printed sources and word of mouth. So even if people never even tasted sugar, they still understood its meanings. The elite Americans who could afford sugar adopted many of the affectations of their British relatives and fellow citizens, including purchasing elaborate tea and chocolate sets and other sugar-related paraphernalia. And here you can see a really fancy tea set. They ostentatiously placed lumps of sugar into their ceremonial tea and patronized the few exclusive confectioners who opened shops in early American cities to sell their precious sweetmeats. But for the majority of American colonists, the culinary world they inhabited lacked sweetness in particular and flavor really in general. Sugar, along with pepper, ginger, cloves, and the like, was at first considered a spice rather than a sweetener, a substance along with all the rest that came from mysterious foreign lands and could be used only sparingly. In fact, throughout the 18th century, sugar by weight was almost as valuable as gold. And that's not an exaggeration, that's true. And it was always kept under lock and key. It was used not so much to make desserts, but to make more palatable other key commodities that were also the spoils of European empire, specifically coffee, tea, and chocolate, which were all bitter things, and they were, sugar allowed them to be sweetened for the American palate. Despite the lack of sugar, people, of course, ate desserts, like fruit pies, cobblers, and dense cakes, taking advantage of the natural sweetness of native fruits. The sweets they consumed tended to be candied nuts and fruits and small pastries, flavored as often with sugar and spices, caraway, cinnamon, ginger, coriander, allspice, and so on. Not surprisingly, in New England, as I don't have to remind you, people also enjoyed maple candies. It's really the first sort of domestic sweetener. And here are some examples of just recipes, early recipes for fruit-based desserts. Even after sugar became more abundant on the market, it was still dear, and sugar-forward desserts were still not available to everyone or even most. But they were somewhat available to the elite, who increasingly enjoyed their cakes, puddings, tarts, cookies, trifles, rusks, preserves, and syllabubs at fancy parties, where they could be shared with and, importantly, shown off to their guests. The first cookbook printed in America and written by an American author was this one, Amelia Simmons's American Cookery, published in 1796. As you can see from this title page, the majority of her book was devoted to desserts, some of which used sugar sparingly and some of which used it quite liberally. Perhaps a more accurate indication of what desserts looked like in early America is captured in Susanna Carter's The Frugal Housewife of 1803, which included an entire appendix adapted to what she called, quote, the American mode of cooking, she put it. The desserts here are telling and much different than the ones in the body of her text and in Simmons's work that came before it. Here, for instance, we can see recipes for making sweetmeats that call for brown, i.e. less refined sugar, and maple syrup rather than, say, double refined sugar. So this really kind of acknowledged the limitations still at the beginning of the 19th century in terms of refined sugar in the market. So although sugar was gradually becoming more plentiful in the American market, it still did not mean that desserts or even small confections were available to everyone or even most. Simmons's cookbook, like others of its time, was geared toward, quote, the lady of fashion and fortune, or someone who had to work in her kitchen as a domestic. And here's a typical bill of fare for that lady of fashion and fortune. Successful desserts were the products not only of scarce labor and valuable raw materials, but as important, they took time, labor, and often special equipment and skills to create. The equipment alone included not only the sugar snips and graters to turn hard cones into light powder, which you can see here. And again, this is something that Andy was talking about in terms of sugar being molded into these hard cones that then you had to do something with. So early sugar consumption required special equipment like these things, but also pie and cake tins, piping bags for icing, sugar spoons, tongs, and bowls, some of which are in the exhibition, and even ice houses, and ice cream freezers in the case of frozen delicacies. So for all of these reasons, desserts were significant things, economically, culturally, and gustatorially. They tasted good and punctuated otherwise bland diets, and they also functioned as important status symbols that showed clearly and materially to one's peers the degree to which families were able to marshal resources of all kinds, from sugar itself, which embodied the slave labor and transportation efforts required to bring it to distant markets, to the necessary equipment to make and eat it, to the staff that would transform it into confections, and so on. So desserts that reached the tables of early Americans brought with them not only sweetness, but power, in the words of Sidney Mintz. This was especially true of table ornaments crafted of sugar, which were meant to be consumed only visually and recalled the earlier practices of European royalty. And so here we have these incredible sculptures made out of sugar. These objects were valued for their novelty and decadence. They were potent status symbols for the very reason that they negated sugar's use as a preservative and a flavoring agent, and because they required tens, if not hundreds, of hours of a skilled confectioner's workmanship, only to be discarded after appearing on a dinner table for one night, though people did sometimes take pieces of them home as souvenirs. For his inauguration in 1789, George Washington employed his own French confectioner, who he wrote, quote, professes to understand everything relative to those table ornaments. Elite women imitated such practices on a smaller scale, hiring out the skilled hands of local confectioners to create smaller sugar pieces, which they often called toys, for special events that would decorate their tables as centerpieces. And these are pretty fancy toys, but this gives you an idea of what they would have looked like on a banquet table. Not to be outdone was ice cream, which was as prized as the finest table ornaments. The earliest record we have of an American enjoying ice cream comes from an account of a dinner at the home of Thomas Bladen in 1744, who was then governor of Maryland. An attendee, William Black, recounted a meal that was, quote, plain proof of the great plenty of the country, a table in the most splendid manner set out with a great variety of dishes, all served up in the most elegant way, after which came a dessert, no less curious. Among the rarities of which it was composed was some fine ice cream, which with the strawberries and milk eat most deliciously. By the late 18th century, ice cream was still considered such a rare treat that it became the star attraction of outdoor pleasure gardens, equal to the drawing power of their picturesque grottos, fireworks, and live music. An ice cream parfait took top billing in the newspaper advertisement for Philadelphia's Vauxhall Garden, a fixture for the city's most fashionable citizens. I actually love this image in this ad. And it's early, 1819, and if you look at typical newspapers at the time, they had very few advertisements, or very few illustrations, for their advertisements. And so this stands out not only because it's this great image of a parfait, but because it's one of the few images that appeared in newspapers at the time. So it was one thing to buy when out on the town. Ice cream, it was quite another for a family to make ice cream themselves. To give you a sense of just what an achievement this would have been, it's worth spending a moment describing the process of making homemade ice cream in an age before mechanical refrigeration. I mean, think about how do you make ice cream when you don't have a refrigerator? First, of course, were the ingredients, and only the very best would do. Fresh cream, often eggs, flavorings and essences, and of course sugar. But there was more. You also needed salt and you needed ice. Ice, it bears noting, was a terribly perishable article, harvested in the winter from lakes and rivers, like any other sort of agricultural product, and you can see them sort of growing ice here and harvesting it. Transported down the East Coast in the bottoms of ships where it would be stored in people's ice cellars over here. So even just this one ingredient to make ice cream required special, arduous sourcing, delicate handling, and effective storage. And you also needed a contraption to freeze the stuff in and a way to keep it churning, to add air bubbles to create the texture that makes ice cream smooth and edible, and not just this frozen block of cream that you can't do anything with. So early on, this entailed using basins within basins, as this recipe shows. You got to keep stirring it, doing all this stuff. So think about the time and the ingredients that it took to make these things. And later, people could purchase specialized equipment like ice cream freezers to do this, again, which were themselves expensive and highly specialized tools that you really couldn't use for anything else. And the most pleasing results were frozen in copper molds made specifically for the purpose. I think these are wonderful. I'm not even sure if I could bear to eat any of these. They are so beautiful. George Washington's confectioner made ice cream for the president. Dolly Madison served it at state dinners. And Thomas Jefferson recorded experiments with ice cream in his personal recipe book. So I hope up to this point I've been able to give you a rough sense of the place of sweetness in early America, emphasizing how rare and special it was, and its ability to seduce the eye as well as the tongue. Fancy desserts were status symbols and clear evidence of wealth, signifying one's power and control over the natural world and the labor of many people. This all changed as the 18th turned to the 19th century, as supplies of refined sugar and auxiliary ingredients became more affordable and more available on the market. This was due in many ways to the same factors that initially constrained the production and consumption of sugar in previous centuries. When the United States gained its independence from Great Britain, it no longer had to wait in line for supplies of sugar from the mother country, but could colonize its own Caribbean plantations and trade in its own right for global sugar supplies. At the same time, the slave trade expanded as well, due in part to this appetite for sugar. So the slave trade provided a steady supply of coerced labor to do the backbreaking work of cultivating and refining cane sugar under terrible conditions. As Andy said, nobody wanted to do this work, and so we enslaved people to do it for us. In addition, as the territory of the United States expanded, there were increasing experiments with producing domestic beet sugar, a substance that was discovered in Germany in the 1740s and that France started developing in the early 1800s. By the 1850s, nearly 17% of the world's supply of refined sugar came from sugar beets. And while the U.S. continued to rely primarily on sugar cane from Caribbean islands until the late 19th century, the very presence of beet sugar in the market increased the total amount available and decreased its price and sort of eased the demands on refined sugar sourced from cane. And this shows you just a map of not actually where sugar beets were grown, but where they could be grown in the United States. Finally, the introduction of new technologies, and in particular steam power beginning in the 1830s, made the processes of extracting juice from the cane stalks and refining it much more efficient and cheaper. Refiners started popping up in major American cities, from one lone American refiner in 1730 to nearly 20 refiners operating in New York City alone by the mid-1850s. At the time, the Journal of Commerce remarked that the city was, quote, nearly encircled by enormous refining establishments easily recognized by their lofty walls and chimneys. And that was because what was going on inside was highly dangerous, flammable. They needed these big structures to kind of contain the processes of refining. Sugar refiners dotted almost American city and became the most lucrative business in New York at the time, which is pretty amazing when you think of everything else going on in New York City in the mid-19th century. Among the first and most successful, of course, as we know, were William and Frederick Havemeyer, who established a sugar bakery, which is a crude refinery, in Manhattan in 1807. They succeeded over several generations due to, in the words of one historian, quote, smart management, shrewd investments, new technologies, and naked aggression. Indeed, Havemeyer and Elder established the first refinery in Brooklyn in 1856. Henry H.O. Havemeyer, whose daughter's extensive collections we were fortunate enough to enjoy here at the museum, began working at the refinery as a boy and grew to become the shrewdest man in his line through his savvy business skills. His brother, Theodore Augustus Havemeyer, was better at the technological aspects of the refining business, introducing steam power for removing moisture from sugar and refining it. He also introduced improvements for recycling the charcoal used for purifying the sugar, devised a carriage to move the heavy molds from one place to another, and assumed the patent on making sugar molds from paper and pasteboard rather than heavy iron. And I mention all of these improvements because they helped the company increase sugar production. By 1869, Havemeyer alone was processing 100 tons of sugar each day. And by 1876, they were producing 100 million pounds of refined sugar annually and employing more than 1,000 men. These production figures were matched, of course, These production figures were matched, of course, by steadily increasing consumption throughout the 19th century. Production didn't just go into the void, it went into people's mouths, and I think that's something we have to remember. People consumed much of it dissolved in tea, cocoa, and coffee, but the main delivery system for sugar during this time was through sweet treats and desserts, which ordinary Americans had been primed to prize and desire. So this is, I think, important. People didn't turn away from sugar because they saw it as a form of empty calories or a luxurious waste of money in most cases, consumers at least. Instead, they quickly accommodated sugar into their diets and budgets, foregoing other foods and other possessions in order to do so. So through this process of what I call democratization, something interesting happened to the meanings of sugar, not as an economic commodity, but as a cultural symbol. It transformed from a tangible embodiment of masculine power and control, really, into something much different, to a substance almost exclusively associated with women and children, a weak, weakened, and devalued thing. These meanings, which developed over the long 19th century, have become so ingrained that they seem natural to us today. We associate women with sweetness and sweet things. We get nostalgic for home sweet home, and are still taught that girls are sugar and spice and everything nice. So I'd like to spend the rest of my time today talking about this democratization process and the shifts in meanings of sweets that resulted from it, using a few examples by way of illustration. Once sugar became more affordable, children were among the earliest adopters. While most cities supported at least one or two stores selling fine confectionery by the beginning of the 19th century, it was really the rise of penny candies and candy shops that helped spread the pleasure of sweetness to the masses. Penny candies were brightly colored and fancifully shaped and looked like dazzling gemstones in their display glass jars. And I wish so much that this photograph had been in color, because this must have been just such a treasure chest for any consumer to go into in the 19th century, but especially children. This must have been just such a dazzling thing. What was more, penny candies were relatively easy and cheap to produce, something that druggists had already discovered when they began coating bitter medicines with layers of hardened sugar, and that's really the origin of the penny candy. Confectionery machines enabled pools of molten candy dough to be cut and shaped into many different forms in great quantities. So if you think of these things almost like printing presses, instead of a sheet of paper going through this, it's a blob of molten candy that goes through and results, depending on the kinds of molds you have, into these various shapes. And there were thousands of different kinds of shapes that these machines could make. These easily edible doses, priced at a penny each, or a penny for a pocketful sometimes, put them well within the reach of all children, even the most disenfranchised, who gobbled them up by the handful. Like the debates about sweetened beverages today, children's consumption of penny candies was of great concern to reformers, who even early on claimed that candy eating would lead to intemperance, gluttony, and debauchery. Yeah, Parley's Magazine, a periodical devoted to children, warned its readers as early as 1835 to avoid confectionery, quote, as if it were poison. Others at the time referred to candy shops as hotbeds of disease, filled with putrid rottenness, and implored parents to stop giving their kids money to spend there. But of course, children did not stay away, and in fact became regular and loyal patrons of candy shops, which by the 1850s and 1860s seemed to be stationed on nearly every block of every large city and small town alike. Show windows and glass-fronted displays showed off colorful candies in ways that made them especially irresistible to children. Their low price point made them accessible even to the poorest of children, who could find a penny by begging, by running errands, by collecting vermin for the city, like a nickel for every rat you catch, and even by scrounging the floors of trolley cars for lost change. Significantly, penny candies counted among the first things that American children ever spent their own money on. So they were like the first sort of consumer goods for this younger generation and helped them grow up to be sort of more mature consumers of other kinds of goods as adults. And they offered cheap consumer opportunities, gateways into fantasy worlds, and simple pleasure. This was a far cry from the sugar kept under lock and key and consumed only by the spoonful of just a few decades earlier. The appetite for candy proved so voracious that by the later decades of the 19th century, the voices of reformers, medical advisors, and even religious advocates became more strident and urgent. Some worried that children were doing things like spending money without their parents' consent or knowledge, which was a problem. Many also saw candy consumption as a form of luxury, indolence, and waste, connected in many ways to the evil vices of self-pleasure. More on that later. Bronson Alcott, for one, warned of the demoralizing effect of confectionery. Because it was a stimulant, it was a tempting indulgence that encouraged impure thoughts by quickening the blood. I know, I mean, these reformers were a little kind of wackadoodle sometimes. Others worried that candy was a gateway drug that would lead children to consume alcohol and tobacco as adults, instilling in them bad habits. Whether or not this was actually the case, children did use candies to mimic the habits of adults, from smoking chocolate cigarettes and cigars and pipes, to eating penny candy shaped like miniature rum bottles, I'm not kidding, to spitting out the juice from black licorice sticks as if it were tobacco. Considered almost as dangerous a substance were the chocolates and bonbons increasingly accessible to middle-class women, as sugar and chocolate became cheaper and as skilled confectioners immigrating from France and Germany saw economic opportunity across the Atlantic. These were not children's but women's candies, with more direct links to sexuality and licentiousness. And they too have a long history. Throughout the 18th century, powdered chocolate was consumed in liquid form, often bitter and unsweetened, and was for a long time considered a healthful beverage for everyone, and particularly restorative for the old and infirm. It was not until inventions and discoveries in the late 1820s that chocolate could be eaten and sold, could be eaten in the solid and sweetened form that is more familiar to us today. And until Milton Hershey adopted German-sourced milk chocolate production technologies in the late 19th century, edible chocolates were supplied primarily by specialized confectioners who understood how to convert the materials into delectable morsels. For these reasons, chocolates and bonbons, unlike penny candies, remained luxury goods until the very last decades of the 19th century. They were associated with decadent things, French culture, wealth, and fashionability. People enjoyed them only on very special occasions. Chocolates, in particular, still also carried some of the associations with sex, as Andy alluded to. As far back as the 17th century, the Spanish believed that chocolate could be used as a powerful aphrodisiac. And here you can see these women, these very kind of sexy women with their cocoa beans. These meanings lingered and found traction, especially among cultural critics who complained about women's consumption of these sweet treats. So it's perhaps not surprising that over time, and particularly after the Civil War, boxed chocolates made by companies like Whitman, Lowney, Schraft, and others, became the go-to gifts expressing romantic affection. Often, the boxes cost more than the chocolates themselves, and like today, they came in a variety of styles and prices, from the humble plain box to brightly colored chromolithographed examples with velvet linings and satin bows. The boxes turned chocolates and bonbons into commodities laden with symbolic meanings. Yes, they were sweet treats, but they were also romantic tokens of affection, symbolic and tangible evidence of the courtship process itself. Because of this, chocolates and bonbons became lightning rods for cultural critics who went after them perhaps even more intensely than they did children and their penny candies. If men ate these kinds of sweets, they certainly didn't admit it. Chocolates and bonbons were confections reserved exclusively for women and sometimes girls. Not only that, but they were to be passively received and consumed as gifts bestowed on them by men and to be consumed under their watchful eye. The Confectioners and Bakers Gazette in 1906 wrote, quote, "Confectionery plays an important part in the development of love affairs. Many stories are told of the powerful influence that is exerted on Cupid's behalf by a pound of chocolates. Indeed, by 1900, there was no doubt that chocolate's reputation as the apex of the seductive edifice of confectionery had been cemented, perpetuated through generations of Europeans and Americans since Montezuma's time. These associations were, not surprisingly, aided and abetted by the Valentine's Day industrial complex, which included not only the confectionery companies, but also those producing boxes, greeting cards, floral arrangements, and the like, who had well commercialized the holiday by the 1870s. Of course, what titillated consumers about chocolates were the very things that made observers wring their hands. Popular writers in the Gilded Age, from suffragists to misogynists, concerned themselves with what they called the woman question, the proper role of women in the private and public sphere. This included questions about their relative independence and the degree to which women should defer to men. It might seem strange, but a good deal of this conversation took place over debates about chocolates. It was okay for a man to give a woman chocolates, but for a woman to give them to herself was cause for concern, since it was a commonly held notion, even by women themselves, that they were inherently wild creatures unable to control their innate desires and appetites. Eating too many sweets could cause bodily harm, eroding one's physical integrity. It is, quote, a positive sin daily to pamper the body with rich dainties, according to Margaret Cox's Young Lady's Companion in 1839. She continued, quote, many constitutions in our large cities are entirely destroyed and a great amount of money wasted by the habits of permitting young girls to stop on their morning walks to indulge themselves at the shop of the confectioner. All these people are so concerned and wringing their hands. What was more, a woman overtaken by her desires for sweets might spend all of her husband's earnings on such things, glutting herself, often in secret, with these deleterious foods. Many writers pointed to the dozens of bonbons and pastries and pounds of chocolates women might consume each day. Quote, to merely pander to the appetite is sensual and debasing. Food is a moral agent and has its effect upon every character, unquote, argued a writer in the Boston Cooking School magazine in 1896. People are taking this very seriously. Even more distressing was the association of chocolates and bonbons with indolence and luxury. It might be okay for a man to give a woman a box of chocolates as a token of affection, but if she purchased and ate these things herself, she was engaging in a form of self-pollution, seeing to her own desires in a way that was both unseemly and sinful. People described the practice as damaging, pernicious, dangerous, inflaming, women out of control. And if boys were to indulge in the same kinds of habits, they too would become effeminate, weak, and lose vitality. They would, in essence, turn into women, and not very strong ones at that. As William Greenleaf Eliot put it in his lectures to young men in 1867, quote, you cannot develop a vigorous manhood by stuffing a boy with confectionery and deforming him in a rocking chair, unquote. By the later decades of the 19th century, the association of sugar and sweets with women and children was fairly complete. By then, sugar and the things made with it had been demoted, having devolved from a status symbol of male power and prowess when a rarity to being economically and culturally devalued after it became democratized. And here I just wanted to show you a few more examples, just by way of wrapping up, how this process played out in the market and the marketplace of ideas. Take, for instance, wedding cakes. You'd be right in thinking that the quintessential wedding cake that we know of today has its origins in those towering sugar sculptures of early modern Europe. Early sugar work was not unknown to Americans. Pieces of it were shown to locals by traveling exhibitors like this very early one of 1765. And as I mentioned, personal confectioners of luminaries like Washington would make these pieces for special events. By the 19th century, the mid-19th century, some very elite families enjoyed their own forms of ornamental sugar work during celebratory occasions, like this Christmas time image published in Godey's Lady's Book in 1858. And notice, of course, the African-American woman who's delivering this sugar piece to the family. But it wasn't until the mass influx of German immigrants a decade or so later that made ornamental sugar work more accessible, particularly in the form of wedding cakes. And here are some examples of their work. This one from the German-American Illustrated Cookbook, these really wonderful sugar pieces, and this illustration of confectioners at work from Frank Leslie's. American brides were particularly taken with Princess Louise's royal wedding cake from her ceremony in 1871. Accounts reaching American reading audiences described the towering thing as a miniature temple, ornamented with allegorical figures and topped with a Vestal Virgin created by Queen Victoria's personal confectioner himself. This started a fad in America. Women loved this thing. So soon they were commissioning bakers and sugar workers to make more affordable versions, patterned on a 3-tiered structure. They often had elaborate piping and top ornaments, which were mass-produced by the end of the century. With the spread of the wedding cake also came something interesting, a parallel popularization of wedding dresses. Brides and cakes started to resemble each other, part of the material language that defined women not only as pure, but as ornamental things. Some scholars have in fact traced the decorative flowers on wedding cakes to the early favors of fabric bows that were sewn onto wedding dresses to be ripped off and taken by the guests as souvenirs. So it's not difficult to imagine that the modern wedding cake was an edible surrogate of the bride. That the bride and the wedding cake by the late 19th century had come to look alike when they could have just as easily diverged seems not accidental to me, but a continuation of how this material language of sugar was refashioned to inextricably link sweetness with women and women with sweetness. One other example I'll provide by way of wrapping up here has to do with, of all things, instant gelatins, which revolutionized desserts at the end of the 19th century. Before that time, to make something as simple as Jell-O salad or dessert required a painstaking and smelly process involving boiling calves' hoofs and straining them, and it's horrible. I've done it myself, and it's really awful. But this was revolutionized in the late 19th century with companies like Knox, Cox, Jell-O, Royal, and Plymouth, who created this instant gelatin that allowed women to make these desserts themselves, and ones that were more pure and more refined, really luscious-looking things. Thanks to these preparations, women could finally make fancy ornamental desserts in their own homes, and they could be quite impressive. Interestingly, men were never shown in advertisements for these products except as the grateful consumers of the finished dishes. Company spokespeople were always women or children, the Knox Cherubs, the Plymouth Rock Gelatin Woman, and one of my favorites, the Crystal Gelatin Woman, who, right, like her head becomes like this bobbing piece of fruit in this molded piece of Jell-O. Most famous of all, of course, was the Jell-O girl, whose bright-eyed visage reassured women that using this newfangled substance would reliably create successful dishes. And her presence in all this advertising also helped further solidify the association of women and children with sweet things. I don't know if this was intentional, but I really see like this Jell-O mold, kind of like her embodying this Jell-O mold right here. So the origins of America's collective sweet tooth, I would venture, is as much about cultural meaning, the ideas we put into our heads, as it is about consumption, what we put into our mouths. The meanings that confectionery came to assume over several centuries and which became crystallized, if you will, during the 19th century are ones that we continue to live with even today, having literally and figuratively internalized sweets along the way. And that perhaps should give us some more food for thought today as we consider the provocative pieces in the exhibition. Thank you.
You showed us a Scientific American article from 1879, and it said one of the best thermometers of a nation's prosperity is the sugar it consumes. And I just love that. I mean, what can you say about that statement?
Yeah, I mean, that tells you something about how we were thinking about advancing advancing technologies to satisfy American tastes, I suppose, that's sort of where we were at. Yeah, especially when you think that sugar, refined sugar, certainly wasn't a necessity. It wasn't something that we had to have, but by then, it was certainly something that most people did think we need to have. It became a need, but it wasn't really a necessary thing. Yeah.
I'm wondering if there were candies or confections that were gendered towards men at all, if they were more on the bitter side, or, like licorice, if you found that in advertising at all?
In terms of the penny candies, they came in all sorts of different shapes. And I don't know if boys tended to buy the ones that were shaped like, guns or horses or whatever, and girls bought the ones that were shaped like dolls and purses. A lot of the penny candies were shaped like miniature versions of consumer goods, things that they would purchase as real things as adults. In terms of what men consumed or admitted to consuming, this is interesting because men would admit to having a sweet tooth, and they often would enjoy like eating ice cream, but it was always something that was something they kind of had to admit to in private, which to me says there's a gendered thing going on, that they're almost like ashamed to admit that they enjoyed sweet things. So whether there was like a male sort of confection, I don't know. Andy? Jawbreakers, cinnamon, right.
Real men consume jawbreakers.
Oh, that's good, yeah, good, yeah, you're right.
I just wondered what you knew about the role of immigrants in the confectionery industry. My husband's grandfather came over at the turn of the century, and he worked for Campbell's Soup, and then he made chocolates. And it appalled me when my children were small and we'd go to visit, he'd give them 5 pounds of chocolates, which I was just overwhelmingly unhappy about. But I mean, I just wondered, there must have been a lot of Italian immigrants who moved into industries like that.
Yeah, and that's really interesting, and I don't know if the talk later today on chocolates will get more into that, but one of the things that's interesting to me is that as the skills come over, different kinds of confections enter the market. So the French really bring the skills to make fancy bonbons and chocolates. The Germans, sugar bakers, sugar workers, are the ones who bring with them the skills to do these really ornamental, the sculptures, the piping on wedding cakes and things like that. So when we talk about democratization, it's a multi-pronged thing. You need the substance, the sugar that's cheap in the market, which comes from the technology and all of that. You need the consumer desire, wherever that comes from, and you also need the skilled hands of the people who can make it. And a lot of that is an immigrant story. And until like these instant gelatins and things and preparations like that women can actually, ordinary women can do in their homes, yeah, immigrants are a really important part of that story and bringing some of, especially the fancier things to market, absolutely, yeah.
Do you think with all the cooking shows, and especially now on TV, all of the bakers and so on, we're having another resurgence of, it seems like there's a lot of men in the baking shows coming back in, but then, so we're kind of going back to when the immigrants first started doing this, and then maybe we'll swing back with more products for the women or something. It's like we're hitting another circle.
Yeah, I agree. I've noticed that myself too. It's like this competitive, again, it's about power and prowess and building big stuff, you know. What can we do with this substance? Yeah. But that's been my impression as well.
You briefly mentioned these pleasure gardens. And I was wondering if you could expand upon those. What else was offered beyond ice cream, or what the environment was like?
Sure. So pleasure gardens were these really wonderful things that grew up in cities in the sort of the last half of the 18th century and spilled over into the 19th century. They're sort of early, they're the precursors to things like beer halls and concert saloons and things like that. So pleasure gardens were located just outside of cities. They were in Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, Boston, I think, had some. And they were for the elite. They were like little resorts outside the city where you could go. Philadelphia's Vauxhall was on the waterfront. People would pull up their boats and enter this sort of wonderland environment that was filled with grottos and sometimes they had ornamental gardens. There were places where you could walk around. You could meet your lover if you wanted to. People would take picnics. And the pleasure gardens were a way for the elite to kind of get out of the rat race of the city and enjoy a quasi-natural environment. An important thing about the pleasure gardens was not only that they had these faux natural surroundings, but that they also had these other special treats. So they had bands playing music. They had fireworks. They were some of the first places where Americans could see fireworks. They had special foods, so people could eat oysters and things like that. And a lot of these pleasure gardens also advertised ice cream as being part of this special sort of environment that you could enjoy. But this was only for the very elite. Ice cream becomes more democratized. I didn't talk about it here, but ice cream becomes more democratized in the cities in the mid to late 19th century, where you have pushcart salesmen. And they're often, getting back to the immigrant story, they're often Italian immigrants who, again, bring their tradition of making fancy ices. They bring that tradition over here, but instead of being sort of what we would consider high-class, very skilled confectioners, they're peddlers. And they're often demeaned on the street. They're accused of selling adulterated or poisoned treats to children. Whether or not that was true or whether that was just, more of the rhetoric of xenophobia that's occurring at this time, it's not quite clear, but regular people who aren't the elite, who aren't going to these pleasure gardens, also do have access to ice cream. It might not be fancy in fancy molds, but you can get, your paper cup with a little scoop of ice cream from the street peddler. Yeah. So.
Great. Well, we'll have an opportunity to ask Wendy more questions during the afternoon Q&A. Thank you so very much. I learned from a colleague in the Protection Services Department and the Guide Department that today, October 14th, happens to be National Dessert Day. So that was not planned, but that was serendipitous and great. So we'll continue. Well, I guess you can enjoy dessert all day long, and it is nationally sanctioned. So I think that's great. Again, wanted to thank our speakers from this morning. I want to thank my colleague, Corey Rogers, Carolyn Bauer, the two curators who many of you perhaps have at least had a chance to pop your head into the exhibition, and we'll spend some more time in it later this afternoon. I want to thank my colleagues in the Education Department, Samantha Bellinger and Chloe Vogt, both of whom I think are outside at the moment working a table, but I want to thank them for all of their organizational skills and the fact that I didn't even know lunch was delivered until I turned around and saw it, because they came in on little cat's paws and just placed it ever so carefully. So they do a fantastic job in making programs like this hum along. Again, a little reminder, don't forget your survey. They're really super helpful. We don't just take them and recycle them. We really do collect the data and try to use it to make every program better every time we offer one of these gatherings. Actually, for those of you who are from the area, we have a couple of things coming up that you might be interested in, and one of them is on November 3rd. We're doing a little wine and design. You can join with us, learn a little bit more about Dia de los Muertos, and decorate a sugar skull. So we're going to keep going with the sugar theme until this show comes down in February. So. I wanted to take the opportunity at this point to introduce our afternoon speaker, who is not only a noted scholar in this area, but also happens to be a colleague whose students we not only welcome in a scholarly fashion, but we get to benefit from them in the education department because we oftentimes get really great interns from her. So it's a pleasure to welcome her here this afternoon. Dr. Susan Ouellette is a professor of history and American studies at St. Michael's College in Colchester. She received her PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her teaching and research interests encompass early America to the Civil War, women's history, labor history, and includes local history. Her enthusiasm for local topics has translated into a number of published books, scholarly articles, and book chapters on the New England and Lake Champlain region. Her really most recent book, just is the ink dry, barely? Yes. An Extraordinary Ordinary Woman, focuses on the life and times of an early 19th century Vermont woman, Phoebe Orvis. And I really like that name because my daughter's name is Phoebe. So let me welcome Susan Ouellette to the podium.
Thank you. I've discovered, as my illustrious colleague discovered, probably way before I did, that if you talk about food, you get people's attentions. And so I've kind of backed into the discussion of chocolate by talking about New World foods, okay? So what New World foods please our palates? And I think lots of people don't necessarily think about this that much. So we're gonna start with talking about the broad sweep of food. Now, most people could probably say maize, corn. And in fact, that's probably the most well-known of New World foods. Beans are also New World products, and these, of course, these are not wild foods that Indian people just adopted. These are domesticated foods that were slowly and surely developed from wild foods into domesticated foods. So all of these things now, the way we look at them, looked entirely different in wild form. And so in some ways it's kind of amazing to think about all of these foods that Indian people developed out of these wild vegetables and things that they turned into wild vegetables that they managed to fill our gardens with. So corn, beans, and squash are the traditional ones, but chilies and all sorts of peppers, avocados, peanuts, potatoes. Often people are surprised to hear that potatoes are a New World product because the first thing that they really know about potatoes is the Irish potato famine. But in fact, it was Incan peoples who developed potatoes, and it was the Spanish bringing them back to Europe, and then the dissemination of potato agriculture that eventually led much, much later to the potato famine in Ireland. And then, of course, in New England, we maple sugar. But my personal favorite is chocolate. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a kind of social history of chocolate. Now, I'm not an expert, so I may not be able to answer all of your questions, but I do know a bit about the background of it, and I'll share with you what I know. So first of all, it was the Olmec people who are believed to have been the first to actually begin to cultivate and harvest cocoa beans. Cacao is what they called it. And they very quickly learned how to make the best out of the beans. And the beans are here inside of the larger fruit. The actual horticulture of the plant is they had been around for a while, so at least 10,000 years. But it's only, we have evidence for about 4,000 years of actual use and domestication of the cacao bean. And so this is what they look like when they're growing on the tree. And then the bean itself is harvested from the fruit. So one of the first things I would say about chocolate, and you've already heard a little bit of this, so I know that you will understand what I'm talking about, is that first with the Olmecs, and then the Maya, and then the Aztecs, the Indian cultures, the classical Indian cultures of the Mexican region and Central and North America began to use chocolate primarily as a drink. Now, it's prepared in a number of different ways, but it's bitter. Sometimes it's served warm, sometimes it's served cold. And there's all sorts of evidence for this connection to chocolate in these ancient cultures. For instance, this ceramic figure right here, he's holding a fruit. And in this is a rare page from an Aztec text, and you can see that this is the chocolate drink that these people are consuming. Although we don't know all of the details, the idea is that first of all, chocolate was considered to be very important and consumed by the top levels of these classical civilizations. Sometimes it was prepared by priests, sometimes it was prepared by royal supporting staff, but the people who consumed chocolate were at the very top of these societies. And that's probably one of the reasons why we know a bit about it, because the kinds of memorials to drinking chocolate are all around the various important people at the top of these societies. So chocolate basically follows the movement of these ancient people. As I said earlier, the Olmec gave this part of their culture to the Maya. They called this shahuatl. Consumption of cocoa beans among Mayan society was primarily in the form of an unsweetened drink made from the ground beans. Eventually, there was a process where beans would be roasted and ground. So I suspect that across these various cultures and across time, tastes for this drink probably shifted. One of the things that was at the basis for most of the consumption of this drink is the belief that it was healthful. It was an aphrodisiac, considered to be something that was really important. But also it was, eventually, the assumption was that you would drink this for medicinal purposes as well. So it was important for rulers to maintain their health, and that's probably one of the major reasons why they drank it, and it became a very valuable product. Beans themselves became important commodities in these societies. They were both used as means of payment, and they were also used as units of calculation. So the importance of these beans is really obvious. So for instance, as both local and international, meaning crossing the Indian nation's lines, currency, a turkey could be bought for 200 beans, or a tomato for 3 beans. Later on, when the Aztecs adopted the social practice of chocolate drinking, and they also adopted its usefulness as currency as well. So you can sort of see that the importance of these chocolate beans is really something that's maintained. Ancient Mexicans believed that the goddess of food and the goddess of water were both guardian goddesses of cocoa. So this was not only just a healthful drink, it was also a spiritual drink. And since the leaders of these societies were also considered divine, that's probably another reason why drinking chocolate is so important. So the Aztecs called chocolate, I'm going to have trouble pronouncing this, cacahuatl, meaning warm or bitter liquid. Cacahuatl is, in the way in which they prepared it, was flavored with a whole variety of local spices. They used chili, they used cinnamon, they used musk, they used pepper and vanilla, and sometimes the drink was even thickened with cornmeal. They also, over time, experimented with preparation methods, including warming the chocolate, and it could be served either warm or at room temperature. And it's not clear whether this was a drink that was entirely prepared by women, but often when you see the images of the preparation, it's women that are doing the preparation, and it's often the men who are doing the consumption. And I think that that is indicative of these societies. Women are the farmers, and in the case of the Aztecs especially, men are the leaders of their society. So I think in many ways, this is a gendered drink, especially in this period. So the variety of products that get combined with cocoa beans and made into these drinks is really kind of amazing. And although I've never tasted chocolate flavored with chilies, I can imagine it might be a really interesting and spicy concoction. I suspect the inclusion of corn might have sweetened it a little bit. And of course, the inclusion of vanilla might have had another kind of interesting permutation as well. So it's not as though they used chocolate and never experimented with it. It's clear that there was all kinds of taste experiments that were going on. And of course, this goes way beyond chocolate, but I think that in the case of chocolate, it's a really interesting kind of history of the way in which food develops among human beings. And of course, in their case, it's happening at the top of their society. Now, a number of different utensils develop around the making of the drink. As I said earlier, at some point, they began to roast beans, and then those beans, as you can see over here, get ground into a kind of powder. As you can imagine, it would be a rough powder, so it's not, don't imagine that you would be drinking something that would be smooth, because the ground up chocolate wouldn't, or rather cocoa beans wouldn't necessarily be ground down into really fine powder. And instead, it would be ground into probably something more of the consistency of cornmeal, for instance. And one of the things that also begins to happen, probably among the Aztecs and certainly later on in the Mexican on the Mexican plateau is frothing the drink. So, and I think that that's kind of goes along with the warming of the drink, because they would take these wooden bowls like this, pour the drink into it, and then with the use of a device like this, I don't know if you've ever seen one of these, but a molinolo, and you basically, as you can see right here, she's holding one of these in the bowl, and then she's twisting it, and these, along this stem, these are loose, and so they're twirling, and that froths the chocolate. So what you have then, and you can see it in the bowl right here, is probably a lukewarm, very bitter, but frothy kind of drink. So I guess in a way you could think of this as kind of like an unsweetened latte made with chocolate, right? So this is really the kind of drink that, that's being consumed when the Europeans arrive in the New World. Now, Christopher Columbus is said to have brought back the first cacao beans to Spain, but Ferdinand and Isabella didn't think very much of them, and so not much happened. In fact, I read one account where Columbus, and this would have been, I think, in his last voyage to the New World, the fourth visit, they came across a trading canoe that was loaded with the cocoa beans, and so they brought quite a few of them back, but I suspect that they didn't really know what to do with them, and given the fact that by then the notion of conquest and the desire and the knowledge of the wealth of the New World probably overwhelmed them, and so cocoa beans don't really rise to any level of interest right away. Columbus himself tasted chocolate that last voyage, and so it may be that he tried to influence the king and queen to think of it as a really interesting product, but again, as I said, they weren't particularly interested. So then, what kind of changes that dynamic is the conquest of the Aztec by Hernando Cortez. When that, in 1529, when the Spanish overwhelmed Montezuma and began to loot basically the Tenochtitlan and the various Aztec centers that they had captured, among the gold and the silver and the jade and the other things that they were taking away, they also started taking away sacks of cocoa beans, because that was part of the wealth of the realm. And so Cortez, again, as Columbus had tried, brought the beans back and began to try and interest Europeans in drinking the cocoa. But it didn't really catch on very quickly. And it wasn't until a group of Dominican friars actually brought back a person or people that knew how to prepare the drink, and then offered it in 1544 to the court, to the Spanish court. And once it was prepared and they consumed it, that changed everything. And I've read a couple of different places that this is true, although there's other places where it's disputed. But there was some discussion that these Dominicans, to make the chocolate more palatable to the monarchs that they were serving it to, they added sugar to it. So it may well be that this first serving of cocoa was really cocoa, was sweetened chocolate, as opposed to the bitter chocolate, or the chocolate spiced with chilies or vanilla that these Indian people would have prepared. Now, one of the things that the Kekchi Maya did was they brought beaten cocoa that they then mixed and served. And so there was a kind of relationship then that was implied by this serving of the cocoa. And I think that that's a really important aspect of these New World, Old World exchanges. From the point of view of the Spanish, they were the pinnacle of civilization, and the people that they conquered were not. And although sometimes when I think about this, I think it's kind of amazing, really, that Cortez would have marched into Tenochtitlan, for instance, and laid eyes on the magnificent temples and the stone buildings and the floating gardens and all of the beautiful architectural aspects, the ball courts with athletes playing, all of the things that would have probably had the same parallels in the old world, and yet he didn't see the equalness of the people that he met with. And the Spanish continued to have this attitude of superiority towards them. So I suspect that this serving of the cocoa was seen as less as a gift from the New World and more as a supplication from newly conquered people. However, that didn't really change the new acceptance and attitudes towards chocolate. So Spanish nobility began to adopt cocoa. They replaced chili spice with sugar, and they kept the cinnamon, and it made the bitter drink much better to their liking. They also began to serve it warm. So it begins to taste and be much more like what we think of as cocoa. According to the True History of Chocolate authors Sophie and Michael Coe, the most likely scenario for the development of the word chocolate in English is that the Spaniards combined the Maya word choco, meaning hot, and the Aztec word atl, meaning water, to produce chocolate. The sort of semantics of this are debatable, but the spread and the interest in chocolate is not. So what you begin to see is this broader interest in the spread of cocoa throughout Europe. And of course, combined with the early spread of sugar and other spices, this means that cocoa begins to rival coffee in some places. So at the beginning of the 17th century, an Italian traveler, Antonio Carletti, discovered chocolate in Spain, and he takes it to Italy, where a chocolate mania just developed. Chocolatiers began to open in all of the major cities. And then from Italy, it spreads to Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. In 1660, Spanish Princess Maria Theresa, there she is right there, gave her fiancé, Louis XIV, an engagement gift of chocolate. So this may be the first time that chocolate, the drink, and chocolate, the aphrodisiac, gets connected to romance. I don't know, but it seems like it's a good possibility. And not only did she give him this gift of chocolate, but she had it packaged in an elegant, ornate chest as well. So it's not a heart-shaped box, but it's still a pretty fancy gift. Their marriage, the marriage of these two monarchs, is symbolic of the marriage of chocolate in the Spanish Franco culture. The word of chocolate spread throughout Europe, and the French were as crazy for it as everyone else. But it had now become fashionable. So you can see that, for instance, in a lot of the paintings of the period, you can see people drinking chocolate. There are some art pieces that show the inside of these chocolate drinking houses. And so there's lots of evidence that this spread is happening pretty much throughout, at least throughout Western Europe. By the middle of the 17th century, chocolate is widely believed across Europe to have medicinal properties. So I suspect some of this is, things that had been absorbed from earlier beliefs, but it's interesting because, again, it becomes kind of and it had always been, but it becomes the drink of the upper classes. So in Europe, it's the nobility that are drinking chocolate. The first official statement about chocolate is made by the brother of Cardinal Richelieu, Buenaventura de Aragon, and he describes the use of chocolate as stimulating the healthy functioning of the spleen and other digestive functions. So you would eat chocolate, and I mean, the idea of chocolate evolving into a dessert, it makes perfect sense in this context because you would eat and then you would drink the chocolate, and that would help the digestive process. Chocolate first became fashionable in London when it was introduced by a Frenchman who opened the first chocolate beverage house that was going to compete with the coffee houses that were already popular. It's still expensive. Chocolate remains a beverage for the elite. The English developed several changes in the preparation of drinking chocolate, which changed it again. So instead of preparing chocolate with water, it's prepared with milk. Some preparations called for Madeira wine, and some even included beaten eggs. And at the same time, chocolate is also now being incorporated into baked goods. So chocolate cake is something that is beginning to develop so the whole idea of chocolate, not just as a drink, but also as something that you would consume, is happening. Louis XIV gave a chocolate monopoly of the Paris chocolate drink trade and the French royal court to David Chalou, a baker who began to experiment with chocolate in biscuits and cakes and the way in which chocolate could be used to flavor other kinds of baked desserts. In England, a 17th century diarist, Samuel Pepys, noted in his journal that he'd been to a coffee house, but he had instead drunk chocolate, and that it was very, very good. By the end of the 17th century, the American Physician, which was a journal, featured a medicinal recipe using milk in drinking chocolate. Sir Hans Sloane brought a cacao tree specimen back from Jamaica to England in 1689. He believed that chocolate, as it was prepared in Jamaica, was therapeutic, and it was more therapeutic because the drink was so bitter. And yet, he couldn't get people to drink it unless he boiled the beans in milk and sugar. And so he basically, through the process of trying to convince his clients that this is a good thing to consume for their health, he created the first milk chocolate drink. His recipe in England began to be passed from hand to hand, and eventually apothecaries adopted it and sold it, and it was marketed as the product that was called Sir Hans Sloane's milk chocolate. So you begin to see the process of how chocolate goes from this bitter powder that's not ground very fine to these more sophisticated usages. But throughout this whole time, we're really talking about the fact that it's only the upper echelon of societies that are consuming chocolate. By the end of the 17th century, solid chocolate was introduced in the form of pastils, small pieces. One reference states that the English ate solid fingers of chocolate in the Spanish fashion. So it's probably something that emanated first in Spain and then began to spread, although I didn't find any direct references to this happening in Spain. Throughout the 18th century, drinking chocolate expanded worldwide among the elite. Chilies completely disappeared as an ingredient except for in Mexican mole sauces. It was the only place it stayed. Massachusetts sea captains brought back cargoes of cocoa beans, and Boston apothecary shops advertised and sold chocolate imported from Europe. So suddenly, chocolate went from being a New World product to being an Old World product. And then the Industrial Revolution happened, and that changed chocolate manufacture and distribution forever. Dr. Joseph Fry of Bristol, England, employed a steam engine to grind cocoa beans, which made the powder much finer and obviously speeded the process, and probably parallels what we were talking about earlier in terms of the whole substitution of machine labor for individual human labor. That invention, the steam engine to grind cocoa beans, led to the manufacture of chocolate on a factory scale. Irish chocolate maker John Hannon imported cocoa beans from the West Indies to Massachusetts to refine them with the help of an American Dr. James Baker. The pair built the first chocolate mill in America, and by 1780, the mill was manufacturing Baker's semi-sweet and unsweet chocolate. Shortly thereafter, the pioneer of Swiss chocolate making, Francois-Louis Callier, opened the first Swiss chocolate factory on the same kind of model. So you begin to see the expansion of machine-mediated chocolate. And of course, you know what's going to happen. The price of chocolate is going to come down because the price of labor is no longer quite as expensive. Overall, the Industrial Revolution enabled mass production of chocolate. It reduced its costs, and it spread its popularity more broadly. In the middle of the 19th century, Joseph Fry's grandson, Francis Fry, then head of the family firm, J.S. Fry & Sons, the makers here, discovered a way to mix some of the cocoa butter that had been taken out back into the chocolate, the cocoa powder, added sugar, and then created a paste that could be put into molds. And so this is the beginning of chocolate bars, right? Fry called this eating chocolate as opposed to drinking chocolate, chocolat délicieux à manger. This was the first modern chocolate bar that we're talking about right here. So, the Cadbury brothers, not to be left behind, adopted and sold a very similar product within just a few years. So Cadbury's producing cocoa, but the Cadbury brothers are also producing chocolate bars. Both the Frys and the Cadburys displayed chocolates for eating at an exhibition in Bingley Hall in Birmingham, England, during Prince Albert's Exposition. This was the first time that Americans, generally speaking, were introduced to bonbons, chocolate creams, hard candies, also known as boiled sweets, and caramels. And of course, all of that was a revelation to them and it came back to the United States with them. And Americans now entered the fray of making chocolate and competing for the model for the market of chocolate. Ghirardelli, who imported beans from Peru to San Francisco, had done so to sell chocolate drink to gold prospectors, who, you know, the gold strikes had happened, and he, in the process of his manufacturing, discovered how to extract cocoa butter from ground cocoa to create a very soluble cocoa powder. Now it could be easily mixed with water or milk. And so you could literally buy the cocoa powder and produce your own chocolate drink, which again was another revelation for ordinary people. And as these kinds of products began to be manufactured in wider ways, what happens then is sort of middling people begin to consume chocolate. Not a broad expanse of them, but certainly chocolate begins to trickle down, so to speak, into out of the elite classes and into the middle classes. And of course, the chocolatiers, the people who were producing chocolate, also began to try to find ways to market chocolate more and more widely. So in England, for instance, Richard Cadbury created the first known heart-shaped candy box for Valentine's Day. And so chocolate and romance are married, and chocolate becomes an important combination. And I think it's not lost, and we've already heard this, that romance, aphrodisia, chocolate, Valentine's Day, all of that comes together into a nice wrapped kind of gift idea. The creation of condensed milk and its addition to chocolate formed the basis for Daniel Peter and Henry Nestle's Nestle Company, which eventually became one of the world's largest producers of chocolate. In the meantime, the Swiss had developed the method of conching, which is a kind of process where chocolate is heated and then rolled, and it refines the chocolate to a very smooth consistency. So this is really, when you eat chocolate now, for instance, if you ate one of the chocolate pieces that were there for dessert, the chocolate melts in your mouth. This is really the process that creates that melt in your mouth kind of chocolate. And of course, this propels Nestle's company this propels chocolate into the major world market for these kinds of treats. The result from this new method, the chocolate was smoother, creamier, and as I said, melt in your mouth consistency. At the end of the 19th century, Milton Hershey incorporated all of these ideas and all of these desires and the marketing aspect of all of this and created a modern mass production process that made chocolate affordable to everyone, or most people. He also created a model factory town, Hersheyville, which was dedicated totally to the production of chocolate. And of course, their key specialty was the chocolate kiss. So by the turn of the century, the stage is set for making chocolate treats affordable for almost everyone. But it was World War I that really brought attention to the candy bar, like the Hershey's candy bar. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps commissioned various American chocolate manufacturers to provide 20 to 40-pound blocks of chocolate to be shipped to the quartermaster bases. And then the blocks were chopped up into smaller slices, and those smaller slices were distributed to the doughboys in Europe, all of whom came home from Europe with a taste for chocolate candy and for chocolate bars in particular. Eventually, of course, the task of making smaller pieces was turned back to the manufacturers, and by the end of World War I, the returning doughboys could purchase chocolate bars in the stores, and that's something that would become much more widespread. Throughout the 1920s, candy bar manufacturers became established throughout the United States, and as many as 40,000 different types of candy bars appeared on the scene over the course of that decade. The 20s also became the decade that was probably the highest point in the consumption of these kinds of really decadent forms of chocolate bars. Probably the reason why that retracts a bit is because the Depression kind of overlays chocolate manufacture, especially chocolate candy manufacture. However, chocolate became part of the regular rations for American GIs in World War II. And when these soldiers, especially in Europe, when these soldiers were sent as part of the war on the European front, candy bars became kind of a currency for getting girls' favors. So stockings were important, but candy bars were really good. So all of this kind of culminates into a major kind of desire for chocolate, taste for chocolate, consumer and cultural ideas converge. And so there's today, annual world consumption of cocoa beans averages approximately 600,000 tons, and per capita chocolate consumption is on the rise. Fusion cuisine of our 21st century has logically found its way into chocolate. Exotic spices such as saffron, curry, and lemongrass are now commonplace in chocolates, in specialty chocolates, as are everyday kitchen foods such as basil, goat cheese, and olive oil. Most appropriately, chocolate has returned to its Mesoamerican roots. Many artisanal chocolatiers now offer some version of an Aztec chocolate, spiced with the original New World flavors of chili and cinnamon. The market has seen major growth in organic and kosher brands, and a high percentage of cacao chocolate is recognized as a functional food, delivering, among other things, antioxidants. And so, I'll end with the fact that it seems that the Aztecs were absolutely right about the healthy properties of chocolate. And so I think we can safely consume it and feel good about that. Thank you.
The live demo portion of this afternoon, Emily McCracken, the resident chocolate sculptress and instructor at Lake Champlain Chocolates, graduated from Montserrat College of Art with a degree in 3D illustration. She has studied chocolate technique at the New England Culinary Institute, the Nodder School of Pastry Arts in Florida, and the Barry Kaibo Chocolate Academy in Illinois. She's created sculptures for celebrities including Wynton Marsalis, Ben & Jerry, Grace Potter, and Dr. Oz, and has been featured on the Food Network, in the Boston Globe, and in MasterCard's Priceless Picks campaign. She enjoys working with chocolate because it is universally loved, as we have discovered today. So let me turn it over to Emily McCracken.
Thank you. All right, thank you guys so much. I'm so excited to be here. Chocolate sculpting is probably my favorite thing to do on the planet, so I'm excited to share that with you guys here today. So the sculpture that I'm going to be working on is a Day of the Dead themed chocolate sculpture. I made a series of chocolate sculptures for our local art hop last year based on Dia de los Muertos. It's a Mexican holiday in which people celebrate deceased family members, friends, pets. It's just a really lovely holiday to remember people in our past. So I figured this would be a great time of year since it is actually November 1st and 2nd. And there's going to be a sugar sculpting sugar skull decorating workshop here, which I'm signed up for. I can't wait. As soon as I saw it, I was like, I have to go to this. Anything to do with like candy and art, I'm there. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by making a lot of flowers. During the Day of the Dead celebrations, they decorate graves of their loved ones, and they also make altars called ofrendas, and they decorate them with marigolds. So we're going to make some marigolds here out of chocolate. So what I have here, we have some delicious white chocolate. I typically like to do white chocolate with my flowers because white chocolate can be colored, so I can make any color that I want to. The coloring that we are going to use to make our flowers is actually a colored cocoa butter. Chocolate really hates water, so you can't just use typical gel paste coloring or food coloring you would find in a grocery store. It needs to be no water. So this is actually cocoa butter, which is the fat of the cocoa bean. That's what gives chocolate that really nice texture, and is also the ingredient in chocolate that is critical to making it temper properly, turning it into a nice, solid, shiny, snappy piece of chocolate. So this white chocolate, we are going to color it with our cocoa butter coloring. I always want to put it in cups that won't stain, because this definitely stains. So we're going to put some chocolate in here. Can anyone smell the chocolate in here? We'll have to change that. We need some smell-o-vision up here for you guys. So I'm going to heat this up. So this I heat up into a liquid, and we're going to just squirt it in there. Stir it up here. So we've now got a nice color for the marigolds. Nice yellowy orange. So in order to make petals, you can actually do many different shapes of petals when you're working with chocolate. It really depends on the type of implement you're using will change the shape of the petals. So this particular offset spatula is going to create a nice rounded edge. Marigolds have rounded edges, so I want to have a rounded knife. Also, if you wanted pointy petals, like if you're doing a poinsettia or a black-eyed Susan or something like that, you could do a knife like this to give it a pointy edge. So depending on what shape leaf you want, you could do, or petal, you could do any sort of knife shape. You could do a big one, you could do little ones, but it's a very useful technique to make all kinds of things. I oftentimes will use this same technique to create feathers, leaves on trees. Yeah, birds, definitely my favorite. I've made a ton of birds, and it's weird. I'm not even a bird person, but lots of my sculptures have had birds in it. But that's a good thing. My daughter, who's 4, is obsessed with birds. So to do petals, you're going to flatten your knife on. You're going to dip it in your chocolate. Smoosh it down, but not too hard. I got to put my hand in front of it. Yes, so this is just parchment paper that I've cut. Other things that you can use, sometimes if I want the backs of something to be very shiny, you could use an acetate, which is just a thick plastic. Saran wrap would be too flimsy. Most of the tools that I work with really aren't fancy chocolate equipment. I'm the only person in the company who does the chocolate sculptures. So we don't have a ton of equipment. So usually what I do is I just look around the factory and just try to find everyday things to make my sculptures. So I don't have a lot of fancy molds or tools. It's pretty much stuff that you can find in your house every day. And I find that that encourages me to be a lot more creative. I'll look around and I'm like, oh, that mixing bowl, that looks perfect for a submarine helmet. And this one looks perfect for a spaceship or whatever I'm trying to sculpt that day. So I just walk around the factory. I kind of look like I don't know what's happening there, but I'm just trying to find that perfect piece to mold. So then what you're going to do after you make your petals is we want them to be curly. So we put them on these little plastic pieces here. They're called flower formers. Usually you find them in the cake decorating section of Michael's. They'll use them for doing gum paste flowers and fondant flowers to give them a little bit of a curve. So once we have all our petals, we can then go ahead and assemble our flowers. So you can only imagine how long it took to make all of these. This is like That was probably about an hour. All right, so to make our flowers, we're going to take a piping bag. This is just parchment paper. You can buy pre-cut cones in Michael's or any of those craft shops in their cake section, but it's a lot cheaper to make your own. So if you can learn how to make your own, you'll save a lot of money that way. So I'm going to fold my paper cone. This took me a really long time to learn how to fold these. This is actually pretty challenging. When I went to the Nodder School of Pastry Arts, or any of the classes that I've taken, especially at the Barry Callebaut Chocolate Academy, where I've taken most of my courses, I'm usually the only person who's not a pastry chef. So oftentimes, they just like zoom in there, they take all the supplies, they don't think I'm cool enough yet. They're like, she's not a pastry chef, she's not one of us. So the first day at lunch is a little lonely. But once I start sculpting and they see that I can keep up with them, the tools get shared a little more. But when I was at the Nodder School, all the pre-made piping bags had been taken. I was like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? So I had to learn very quickly how to fold those bags. So it was good that happened. It forced me to learn, because I used to go in the factory and ask my mentor to fold them for me. I'm gonna squirt a little button of chocolate here. And I usually make an assortment of sizes of petals. So I'm going to use larger ones. Here are my larger ones. So check this out. So cool. These are my little petals. And what I'm going to use to help me out today is some freezing spray. When you hold chocolate in your hand, it melts, especially when you're standing in front of a large group of people. Your hands might be a little warm. So we're going to use our freezing spray to kind of help freeze things in place a little bit so I don't have to stand there holding it while it's melting in my hand. This is totally food-safe spray. I ordered this from the same place I got my colored cocoa butter. It's called Chef Rubber. That's its real name. It's so weird. I don't know why it's called that, but that's what it is. But this is a totally food-safe spray. If you are making a chocolate sculpture that people are not going to eat, a much cheaper alternative is you can actually use a computer air dusting can. You turn it upside down, and it freezes it cold. So when we go to classes and workshops, that's what they give us to practice with when we're learning how to make showpieces, because no one's going to eat it. But if people are going to eat it, like today, one of you is going home with this sculpture. Did you guys know that? That's pretty awesome. But I don't bring it home for you. So good luck with carrying it home in the car. But it's going to... That does not come with the raffle prize. But I'll tell you what, it's an adrenaline rush. When we brought my sculptures that are in the Sweet Tooth exhibit, we sat on milk crates in the back of the Lake Champlain Chocolates van, just holding them on our laps. It was a long drive, let me tell you. And then going up this bumpy road up here was crazy. So, all right. So because I let this chocolate set up a little bit, which is good, it's kind of holding it for me. So you can kind of start to build your flour. Oops. Has anybody here ever worked in chocolate before? No, we must change this. Chocolate is so fun, but you need a lot of patience for it. Chocolate is so temperamental. It has a mind of its own. It does what it wants to do. Basically, it owns you. Because chocolate is very sensitive to temperature. So if you're working in an environment that's really warm, it takes longer for things to set up. If you're working in an environment that's really cold, it's setting up so quickly, so you have to move extra fast. Temperature in here is fabulous. I need to set up a permanent studio in here. This is awesome. I do demos too at our Pine Street location at Lake Champlain Chocolates, and usually it's really hot and very crowded. So making chocolate sculptures tends to be a little bit trickier when you're in such a hot environment. So you're gonna just keep going around until you build your flower. And I have to remember to breathe. I oftentimes forget to breathe while making sculptures. I know, it's like, oh yeah. Well, these petals, I mean, they're like, you know, they're thin, so they're very fragile. So I try not to break them while I'm working with them, but that's usually why I'll make thousands of them at a time, because you can never have enough extra pieces. And the good news is there's always someone who's willing to eat them if there's stuff left over. So not a problem. And then you can just finish off with the final ones in the middle. So this is crazy. We're building a sculpture in 45 minutes, just so you know. Typically, sculptures take a lot longer than this. I mean, I've put at least 10 hours of prep work in this ahead of time. So this is definitely not something that typically happens in this short a period of time. The sculpture that I did for Food Network was 40 hours worth of work for one piece. But it was 5 feet tall, and it weighed 65 pounds, and it was a working chocolate cuckoo clock. It was huge. It's the biggest thing I've ever made, and they're like, and we need it in like 5 days, because they had a really tight taping schedule. There we go. Well, unfortunately, it never got eaten. It went to the big compost bin in the sky, but let's see if I can pick this up without. So we're gonna put this guy over here. And like any good cooking show, we've already got the casserole made, so I have tons of flours for us to use. All right. So the other thing I want to show you, hopefully I can keep this within time, is we're going to make some leaves. So this is the acetate that I was telling you about. This is actually for printmaking. I had a friend who took a printmaking class at Burlington City Arts and decided it wasn't for her. And she's like, do you want this? I was like, yes, that's like gold. I do want that. So we're going to make leaves. Leaves are typically green. Although in the art world, you know, you can do whatever you want if you're an artist. Get really creative. But we're going to go green. So I'm going to take my cocoa butter. And we're just going to smear it right on there. I won't lie, it's super fun. Anytime I get to make a mess. Although the problem is I always have to clean it up. I do a lot of dishes at work. So if I had anything to say that wasn't fun about chocolate sculpting, it would definitely be doing dishes. So, all right. So you can do different things with this. If you wanted to actually color chocolate first and pipe it on here, if you wanted really specific designs, you could pipe it ahead. You could take a paintbrush. You could paint this on the acetate if you wanted really specific designs. I'm just doing leaves, so I just need kind of a basic green color. So just to show you. So we've got our green color on the background. And if you're going to layer color, you should actually start with your lightest color first, because whatever color you put down first is the one that's going to show up on the top. You're basically building layers. So if you were doing multiple colors, you would start with the lightest one and then end on your darkest one. So the next thing we need to do is pour some white chocolate on here. Again, I mean, you can use any of the chocolates. You can use any of the chocolates that you want, but white chocolate shows the best color out of all of them. Get a little bit more in there. Usually I have like a ladle or something. I was trying to pack light. Okay. So once you get your chocolate on there, you're going to take your offset spatula and you want to spread it really thin, because leaves are pretty thin. I didn't put enough chocolate on here, but you want to cover the whole thing in white chocolate. So the tricky part that's going to happen is you have to wait for this to almost dry. If it's too dry and you try to cut any chocolate, it shatters into pieces. If you wait till while it's too soft, the chocolate's just going to melt back into itself. So the trick is getting it to a point where it's sort of fudgy in texture. So once this gets to the desired fudginess, for lack of technical term, to get to that, if it depends on the thickness, I would say if I'm doing thin pieces like this, probably within 5 minutes you're going to get that texture. If I'm doing thicker pieces, like the piece you're going to see in a little bit when I cut slabs, I move it into our cold room. I'm so spoiled. We have a cold room. It's about 30 degrees in there, and it's a dry cold. And it's going to get my thicker chocolate to a fudgy texture in about 10 minutes or so. But you have like the tiniest window to cut it in. So oftentimes people will see me running through the factory like crazy, being like, oh my gosh, it's time, the chocolate's ready. Because while I'm working on one thing, something's cooling in the other room. So I try to multitask while I'm sculpting, but then sometimes I forget that pieces are waiting in the cold room for me. So then what you're going to do is cut right in the fudgy chocolate your leaf shapes. So by cutting them ahead, this will release them from the plastic. So I don't know if I'll be able to hold this up because it's not totally dry yet, but you'll cut your leaves right into the chocolate. You could use a cookie cutter, definitely. I find it doesn't work as good for thicker pieces of chocolate. It gets stuck in there. But for thinner pieces, you could definitely do that. All right, so we're going to put this guy over here. Oh, look at that. How did that happen? So I'm going to roll it up once it's in that fudgy state. If it's too hard when you roll it, it's just your leaves are going to break into a bunch of pieces. So we're going to roll it because we want the leaves to kind of have a little bit of curl to them, so it gives it a little bit more of a natural appearance. And I was hoping this wasn't going to come apart in the car. I'm like every pot home, like, ooh. Okay. See, look at that. So what happens is we can peel this plastic off. I'm just going to stick that down there. This is my favorite part. So they're just like falling out. So the reason I put it on this plastic is not only to transfer the color of cocoa butter, but it makes it very shiny. So when you pour chocolate onto a plastic surface like that, it's going to give it that extra sheen. So chocolate is shiny in general if it's tempered properly, but the plastic is going to give it much more of a sheen. So then you've got your leaves, and just by smearing the color on there, I think it just gave it enough of that sort of leafy color and texture that I was looking for. So now, what was that? You could. I probably would. I'm just going to leave them this way. I break them apart. I could potentially, would be cool, is to scratch right in it if I wanted to give it that veiny appearance. But you could definitely do that. One other way I like to do leaves is, for another sculpture I did recently, you can actually paint real leaves with chocolate. So you find a leaf, make sure it's super dry before you do it. Take a paintbrush and you actually are going to paint chocolate directly onto that real leaf. Let it completely dry. Once it's dry, you peel the leaf off and you're left with, it shows all the beautiful veins in the leaves and all of those textures. So you could do real leaves if you really wanted to. But for this one, I wanted it to be, this is a little bit more representational. So we've got our leaves ready now to add to our flowers. And we're going to start assembling our sculpture. So this is the part where the breath holding will begin. Okay. Okay. Parchment paper down. I have a tarp behind me. Like, I am ready to make a huge mess if I need to. No, I won't, I promise. All right, so this is the base of our sculpture. Whoever wins this, I hope you like chocolate, because you're going to be eating chocolate for a really long time. So this is a hollow box that is all made of 54% semi-sweet dark chocolate. Typically, when I do chocolate sculptures, I always like to use dark chocolate as my base. It is the strongest of all the chocolates. Because it doesn't have the dairy products that milk and white chocolate have, it's much sturdier in its structure. So typically, I'll make any bases out of dark chocolate. White chocolate's going to be the softest out of the 3 chocolates because it has the highest fat content. It's probably why it tastes really good. So what I did to do this base was I glued some of these chocolate slabs together with liquid chocolate, of course. And to decorate the sides, this is one of my favorite things to do. So to do this, I do this oftentimes if I'm doing trees or if I want just some sort of texture. Because when you're making sculptures, you want to have a really nice balance of textures throughout your piece. You don't want it to be all smooth and shiny. So the painting the chocolate on gives it that nice texture, and it's really fun. So I had to do it. So I'm going to glue my top part on. I've got my 54% dark chocolate here. I forget how awesome it is to work around 1-ton tanks of chocolate. We have 4 1-ton tanks of chocolate in the middle of the factory that I pull chocolate from on a daily basis. I'm like, wow, I forget how cool that is because I do it every day. I'm like, wow, I could spill literally a ton of chocolate on the floor right now, which would not be looked highly upon, but it's been done. I was giving a tour. I used to be a tour guide at the Lake Champlain Chocolates store, and I was giving a tour, and all of a sudden the tank was overflowing. Someone had overfilled it. It was going down the sides of the tank. It was all over the floor. And then the people on my tour were asking, why are they not cleaning it up right away? Well, the reason is hard chocolate's a lot easier to clean up than wet chocolate. So we let it harden, and then you just take we had a scraper. I don't know if it actually was a hoe, and just scraped it up off the floor. So it's a lot easier that way. Okay, so I'm going to glue. This is my base piece. I'm going to put this to the side for a second. And we're going to start building our main piece. So we're going to put this up on top. This is, again, dark chocolate. My sculptures range from a really wide variety of, I don't know, dimension. I do ones that are completely 3-dimensional. I made this crazy turkey. It was like this big, and it took 18 hours, and it was totally 3-dimensional. It was really cool. And then I do just simple things like little chocolate frames, or I'll do combination sculptures, kind of like this one, where it's a little bit of 2D and 3D. I don't. Well, I do, everything that I make is for Lake Champlain Chocolates. They'll essentially kind of commission me, which means do my job, and make sculptures for different occasions. So I usually do a Valentine's Day demo, I'll do a Christmas one. I do the Art Hop every year in the south end of Burlington. I usually do a whole sculpture exhibit for that. So I don't take special orders, which is such a bummer, but hopefully someday I can do that. But for the time being, I just do stuff for the company. So we've got some skulls. We need some sugar skulls made out of chocolate. So these are white chocolate with colored cocoa, white chocolate that's been colored with the colored cocoa butter. So we have a few different ones here. We've got some with the eyes cut out of it right there. I made all of these in advance. Oh my gosh, this actually took a really long time because you have to go through, pipe all your designs in the dark chocolate, mix each color individually, and then pipe it into all of these pieces. So in order to get this done on time, I definitely had to do this in advance. So I'm going to glue some chocolate on here. For the skulls, I did them all kind of at different times. I would say at least a couple hours probably in order to do those. Let's glue this one on. Got to look at the placement, make sure you place them in not strange places. So I'm just gluing this on with liquid chocolate. Who needs glue when you have chocolate? So the reason I'm going to glue these on now is because gluing anything vertically, really terrible. I mean, I'll be able to do some with the freezing spray, but heavier pieces like these skulls, I'd rather just do ahead of time. So I'm not watching my piece slide down. It basically looks like it's crying because it's sliding down. All the chocolate is just very unhappy. So I've got all my skulls on here. Just gonna give them a quick little zhuzh. I think that's a Rachel Ray word. Okay, so I'm gonna put the flowers on. Let's try vertical. Let's be crazy. All right, I gotta get this done in 45 minutes. Okay, so hopefully, actually while these are setting, maybe I'll glue the front pieces on just to be sure. So the other things that I made, typically when people are decorating for Day of the Dead, they have these strings of these beautiful paper flags. So I made some of those out of chocolate, of course. So we've got some little flags here. These I hand piped. Last year when I made some, I cut them out of modeling chocolate. You can use modeling chocolate is basically when you mix chocolate with corn syrup, it turns it into a pliable dough. I like using modeling chocolate a lot because it allows you to really sculpt. Like it allows you to use it like a clay. You can do anything in it. But the thing with modeling chocolate is, does it taste good? I mean, it does. It tastes kind of like a Tootsie Roll more so, but plain chocolate like this, I feel like has just a better mouthfeel and just tastes better in general. So I try to only use modeling chocolate if I really need to sculpt some fine details, but usually I'll try to use regular chocolate. So the paper flags can be anything. They'll do like hearts and skulls and flowers. They're a lot more elaborate cut than this one, but I'm working in chocolate, so we have to compromise just a little bit. So I'm gonna glue some of these on. Let me grab another flower one. Oops. Packing these guys was tricky. I also stole all of the factory's bubble wrap before I left today. I love Saturdays because no one's in there. I was like, great, I'm gonna get all the supplies I need today. What did I do with the piping bag? Oh, there it is. Okay, so we're gonna glue these on. Sometimes when your bag gets stuck, like the chocolate hardens in the end, you can just kind of purge the end. You can kind of squeeze that setup chocolate in it. Okay. So far I've remained pretty neat, only a little bit of chocolate. I need to order some new chef coats, and I asked my boss if this time I could do a color. I'm like, white shows chocolate so badly. I think that's the point of a chef coat, is it's supposed to show that you work super neat. I've gotten better, let me tell you. Especially when I found out I was the one who had to do the dishes. Like, I got real neat. I got good at not, I got super good at not needing to use dishes. Most of the time what I'll do is I'll open the valve on the tanks and I let the chocolate just spill out and make big puddles on the sheet trays instead of filling a pitcher and then dumping it. That was like my favorite thing I ever did. When I taught classes, we used to have an education kitchen at South End Kitchen, and I taught a chocolate bar making class. I had to wash 25 molds by hand every single class. That was not fun. Teaching, amazing. Cleaning chocolate mold, really not. Okay, so we're gonna glue these on. think I'm going to give a little dollop of chocolate right there. Can you have too much chocolate? I don't think so. Okay. Ooh, this perfectly fits 3. I love when that happens. Okay.
When you're forming your ideas for these sculptures, do you start by sketching?
I do sketches. Oftentimes I will do a lot of research for what I'm doing. So for the research for this one, I found this amazing kids book at the library. And the pictures were amazing, and it really explained the holiday well. So I go look at books, I get online. One of the things that my illustration professor told me when I was in school, he's like, research is so important because if it doesn't look believable, no one's gonna believe it. So you need to do that research and really understand what it is that you're making. I just did for Art Hop a series of sculptures called, it was the Great American Road Trip. So I featured the East Coast, I did Route 66, Las Vegas, and what was the other, Yellowstone National Park. So I actually looked up the Yellowstone National Park sign so I could replicate it properly. I tried to find a hotel on Route 66 that really exists. So the Blue Swallow Motel is in New Mexico. And it was so cool, they let me put it on their Facebook page. So they were hoping I was gonna mail it to them, but that sculpture wasn't going anywhere. Okay. So now we've got our flags on. Now I feel like I can put this up. So now, this is the super scary part. So, although I've done bigger sculptures, when I was doing the Food Network one, I had to put a huge cuckoo clock on top of the stand that was about this high. I didn't know if it was gonna hold. It was the day of the taping. It's like, oh my gosh, chocolate gods, please be with me today. And they were. I put it on top and it stayed, and we had it up for like a year. It held up just fine. Okay. So now we're gonna stick this up in here. This is where I wish I actually was an octopus and had lots of arms. I'm gonna give these a little bit of a brace. Ooh, that's close.
Do you have any objection if I take your picture?
No. Oh, I'm used to it. It's okay. So I'm going to put little chocolate braces behind it because I care about whoever brings this home today. Okay, we're going to reinforce. I want to turn this so you can kind of see. Let's just move the whole paper. Let's not risk it. All right, I'm just going to fill another piping bag. I'm going to say at least 10. 10 pounds of chocolate. Hope whoever gets this is super hungry. Because like I said, delivery does not come with the raffle. I want you to experience what my life is like on a weekly basis. The furthest I've been was when I did a chocolate sculpture for the Dr. Oz show, and we made a special box for it, and we had to drive all the way to New York City with this sculpture in the car. Longest ride of my entire life. Plus, we're in, downtown New York City. We're going to 30 Rock is where he films. Oh my gosh, it was terrifying. They wanted me to do, I did the Dr. Oz logo, and then I also made a sculpture about the health benefits of chocolate. Yeah, it was a really cool experience. I did get in trouble with security, however. I wanted to go to the top of the rock, and I had my sculpting kit with me, and I had a knife in there. So they took my knife away. It was my good one, too. No, he threw it in the trash. Yep. I was like, I swear it's for chocolate. Because you have to bring a repair kit. I know. I mean, that was a good knife. It was the same as my, wherever that one went. It's the same as my little paring knife. Okay. Well, they're saying that you should eat an ounce a day. An ounce is about a third of our standard size chocolate bars at Lake Champlain Chocolates. Our typical bar is about 3 ounces, so it's about a third of that. And it's just solid dark chocolate, and they're saying chocolate that's 70% or higher is where you're going to get the antioxidants. So that does not include, which I've really made some people sad, it does not include truffles, caramel, creams. It's just solid chocolate. I suppose nuts wouldn't be so bad. Nuts are, they've got protein in it, so you could do like a dark chocolate almond bark if you wanted to. But 70% or higher is where you're going to get those antioxidants from. So it was really about that. It's good for, I'm trying to remember, it's been a long time since I gave tours, because now I make chocolate more. But I think it's supposed to be good in helping to lower blood pressure. One thing that I always joke about, but kind of true, it's good for the soul. Happy people. It's important to be a happy person. It's very unhealthy to be an unhappy person. So you can see we've got lots of flowers made here, and we're going to try to glue them on vertically, because why not? Okay. I like the orange ones. We'll go with those first. My personal favorite chocolate is, I'm doing this backwards. You know what? There we go. Just gonna glue this on. Okay. Good flour. Whoops. That will fit on there. Will you fit in there? Oh, yeah, you will. And you've even got a little brace from the skull. One good thing about chocolate sculpting is you learn to become very ambidextrous. Also, being a chocolate sculptor, your 4-year-old is obsessed with your job. She loves telling all her classmates how her mommy works at a chocolate factory. It's so cute. Oh my God, she is. The other day, she goes, Mommy, I want to be a cooker when I grow up. I have her every Wednesday, and we bake every Wednesday. Whoops, we're sliding. No problem. I just wanted to make sure you guys were still paying attention. Okay, let's get some more pink one. Question is that going to fit? Ooh, that like just fits, great. So oftentimes, I mean, I'll do a sketch, but it doesn't always come out the same way. Sometimes, you know, things change as you're working on it. Oops. Just broke a petal. That's okay. That's why we make lots. We'll make lots and lots of flowers. Definitely want to make sure you don't stick your face in front of this or your hands. Like, sometimes I'll have people helping me. I'm like, just watch your face while we're doing this. Let's get some leaves on. Oh, and then I forgot the coolest part we're going to put on there. So excited. I never thought in a million years I was going to be a chocolate sculptor when I grew up. And it's pretty cool. It's very hard to find a job in art. So I feel very fortunate that I found one, and such a delicious one to do. I just feel like chocolate brings so much joy to all people, like most everybody. I've met a few people, believe it or not, who don't like chocolate. Like, what are you doing in Lake Champlain Chocolates right now? But I've had people come in, they're like, yeah, I don't really like chocolate. I'm like, yeah, that's really kind of weird. The only thing I've ever done in school, I took a 3-dimensional illustration class, and we sculpted in vegetables. I've done some vegetable sculpting, but I'm trying to think if I've done anything else. I mean, I do cakes, but that's about it. Got to try some butter sculpting, maybe. That seems really hard. Mm-hmm. So the debate over white chocolate is real. But what I will say, white chocolate, technically white chocolate is chocolate if it contains at least 33% cocoa butter. Cocoa butter can only come from the cocoa bean. So chocolate can't be chocolate without cocoa butter. So if white chocolate has at least 33% cocoa butter, you can consider it to be chocolate. That's how we feel. I think it's pretty legit. I am a huge fan of all chocolate. Let's use our new flour we just made. It depends on what's in it for me. I seriously will eat just about any kind of chocolate. The only thing I don't like, nobody make fun of me too much, I don't like mint and chocolate. I know that's weird. I think it's like after I was pregnant and I just didn't feel great every morning and I was eating mints to make myself feel better. Like that's all I associate it with. I feel like mint ice cream is like toothpaste ice cream. My husband loves it. He's like, I don't get it, but at least that means more for me. But mint is not my favorite in chocolate, but just about anything else I'll eat. My favorite Lake Champlain chocolate product is our hazelnut 5-star bar. My God, I'm obsessed with hazelnut. If there is hazelnut in it, I will eat it. I will eat all of it. The other weird thing, don't tell anyone, I also am not a peanut butter fan. Don't like peanut butter. I don't. I know that's so weird. Everybody likes peanut butter, except for me. I would rather put Nutella on a sandwich if I or, I like almond butter as well. All right, let's get some more leaves down here, and then I'm going to show you my last part. I'm worried I've gone over time. I did not wear a watch today, so I apologize if I've gone over. Sometimes I just get in the zone and I forget what's happening. Let's put one down here. Oops. That's a little too scary. I have to remember you have to take this home with you. So I'm just going to do a couple little dots around my edge. So one thing that we're missing from our display here is we need some candles. They oftentimes will light candles. We're going to make some chocolate candles because everything I make is chocolate. Chocolate really was a perfect medium for me. When I went to art school was rough, let's face it. I started at Rutgers University majoring in ceramics. My parents were really excited. My dad's like, "You're going to be a potter." My father is a veterinarian, so he can't even draw a stick figure. So he was like, "Well, it's your life." So I went to school there, and everybody was really focused on throwing pots, working on slab work, and doing experimenting with glazes. But not me. I loved to sculpt people and animals and creatures, and I painted everything in acrylic paint. I used no glaze. So finally, my teacher came up to me at school, and he was like, "Emily, I don't think your work belongs at this school." He was like, "I think you belong in an illustration program." So I transferred to Montserrat College of Art after 3 years at Alfred. Went for another 3 years. I should be a doctor by now. I like to say I'm a doctor of chocolate. But when I got to Montserrat, they didn't have a ceramics department. So, and then doing illustration, everybody was painting and drawing. I was like, oh my God, I'm such a weirdo here. What am I gonna do? So I drew and I painted, and they were not as awesome, because that's not what I do. So finally one day, I got tired of being the one who had the worst piece in the class, and I sculpted. I bought some air dry clay, and I made my piece. And Fred, my professor, he was like, "Oh my God, throw your canvases away, throw your paper away." He's like, "You need to be sculpting." And so the problem was we didn't have a ceramics department, so I always had to use air dry clay. If any of you have ever worked with it, it's horrible. It's very brittle, falls apart really easily. So I had a lot of broken pieces. I didn't have much survive the end of school, but as long as they made it to the critique, I was good. But that piece that I made for the first time ended up in the senior show, and I was considered a sophomore just based on credits and stuff. So that piece really changed me. So I just basically had to make my own medium there, and it works well with chocolate, because chocolate is also brittle, fragile, terribly dangerous. So it just really was a fitting way to go. It was a great direction to go into. Okay, so. Yes. The first piece I ever made was actually out of modeling chocolate, and I had made a griffin. I know, it's kind of crazy, but Alice in Wonderland is my favorite story. I own 30 editions of Alice in Wonderland. And the griffin's a character in it, so I just felt like that was a really good way to go. So I'm going to finish off with making a candle. So I was saying to you that I don't really have special fancy molds. So I look around, and these are our sample cups for hot chocolate. Is this not the perfect votive size? It's perfect. Couldn't believe it when I found it. So what we do, again, I don't have a ladle here, so we're going to use the spatula. But if you're not getting messy, then you're not having any fun. That's the way I look at it. That's the way my 4-year-old looks at it. Okay. You know what? We're almost done. Okay. So in order to make your votive, you're going to fill the cup with chocolate. Like, it's completely full. If I tip this, it's going to go all over the place, but it's totally full. So what you're going to do is, I took these and I put them in the refrigerator for probably 3-4 minutes. You don't want it to completely solidify. So what you're going to notice, the process that I'm going to talk about is called shell molding. So if you ever want to make a hollow vessel, like doing this is a great idea if you want to fill a chocolate cup with a mousse or a ganache or some sort of alcohol. You could do shots out of these little cups. Be great out of chocolate. Then you get to eat it when you're done. You can put ice cream in it. So hollow vessels, really useful technique. So what you're going to do is, as this is beginning to dry, you're going to notice the edges dry faster than the middle. So when you see a little ring around the outside forming that's hardened, depending on how thick you want it, you're going to then dump the rest of the chocolate out. So when you see the ring around the top, then you're going to just dump the middle back out. Actually, I mean, this is going to be a little thinner because it wasn't set yet, but it's going to leave a shell of chocolate around the outside. Then you're going to let that set completely. Oh, look, it's done. It's amazing. And then you pop it out, and you've got a perfect little clear votive. So one thing that I did have to do to this is I took a knife and I just trimmed it up a little bit. I wanted to make sure that my hands are a little warm. Let's put some gloves on. So I took a knife and just cleaned up the edges, because the edges were a little bit messy when I poured it out. And then so I went to Christmas tree store and I bought a bunch of these little, make sure that they're LED. LEDs are not hot. If you buy regular, you're going to really melt your candles. You might want to be going for that effect, I'm not sure. But you're going to put these on. You can dump them right in. And you can light up your little ofrendas. When chocolate hardens, what's awesome is it shrinks. So it just pops right out. And it was tempered properly. If the chocolate wasn't tempered, it could very easily stick in your mold and it's not going to come out. And it's really unpleasant to have to clean that. So I don't want to put it in front of the skull, but there we go. So now you can have your own little shrine made out of chocolate. So it's cool. At the end of your dinner party, everyone could eat the candles if they wanted to. You know, have one of those things where it's like, is it or is it edible? You could dye the chocolate too if you wanted to have colored candles. I've made blue ones before. You could do pink ones. Any color you want, you can make the candles, and it will give a little bit of that light. But yeah, the candles were my favorite. The sculpture that I did last year that really had the candles was I made a shrine, a typical shrine used in Day of the Dead. And it was a little shrine to my dog. He passed away last year. So I made a little shrine for him, and I had the candles in it, and the light in it really made a big difference. It just created a mood, and I feel like it really resonated with people. And that's what this holiday was really about. So it was just really fun to be able to share a little bit of that with people. A lot of people didn't know what Day of the Dead was, so I was really excited to educate people on such an amazing holiday. So that is my sculpture, and one lucky person will be taking this home. Do you guys have any questions about anything for me? Thank you. Well, the skulls are representing the people who have passed. And then typically on the sugar skulls, they'll often write the names on the forehead of the people that they're celebrating. So it's representing the actual people who have passed. But they do sugar skulls, and they also do chocolate skulls as well. And then they also make, I've never made bread. I can't believe I'm saying this, I've never made bread. But they make a bread called pan de muertos, and it's this like sweet bread that has like little bone shapes on top, and it's got an orange glaze, and it's kind of like an anise flavored bread. And they'll usually put those in the altars as well as an offering to the people who have passed, and then they also make a loaf for themselves to eat as well. But my bread baking skills are not there yet. I stick to chocolate right now.
So Emily, when you started at Lake Champlain, did they know about your sculpting prowess, or did you just have a job and then, oh, by the way, you're a great sculptor?
Yeah, it's crazy. I was out of college, and most college kids are pretty broke when they're done school. So I had to move back home. Montserrat College of Art is in Beverly, Massachusetts, near Salem. So I moved back home, and I was just walking up and down Church Street, just trying to find a retail job. And I had a stack of applications. I wanted some chocolate. Went into Lake Champlain Chocolates and bought a hazelnut truffle, of course, because hazelnut. And they were like, oh, I see you have applications. You should apply for a job here. I was like, all right. And it was between Lake Champlain Chocolates and The Gap, and Lake Champlain Chocolates won. I do love clothing, but I do love chocolate a little more. So I started there, and I became the manager of the Pine Street store a couple months later. And Gary, my supervisor, he was like, wait, you do three-dimensional illustration out of clay? I bet if you can do clay, you could also do chocolate. So he sent me in the factory to kind of mess around and see what I came up with. And I came back with my Griffin. He's like, yeah. He's like, we're doing this. So they sent me to different courses. So it was great. I got to go down to Florida. I get to go up to Canada multiple times. Hopefully I'm going to be taking another showpiece class next year. So yeah, it's weird how sometimes life just takes you in these directions. I never expected to do that. And when I applied at Lake Champlain Chocolates, like my sculpture background really wasn't even brought up in my interview or anything. So I've been there for 15 years. So I was 24 when I started. I turned 40 this year, oh my God. So yeah, I've been there for 15 years, and I was the manager of our retail store for about 12 of those years. And I would do sculpting in amongst managing the store. And then I had my daughter in 2013, and I didn't want to work 5 days anymore. I wanted to cut down to 4 days. And you can't really be a manager and not work 5 days, and I was like totally fine with that. So when we opened South End Kitchen, I was able to teach courses there. I did all the chocolate making classes. I did a kids chocolate sculpture class, which was my favorite class of all. Kids made the most amazing sculptures, and they had fun, and all the parents were just like, I've never seen my child so focused, ever. You know, chocolate just does that to people. So we did shut that down, unfortunately, but we'll hopefully be, someday we'd like to open another chocolate education center because the chocolate classes were the most successful. But I work in all of our retail stores. I work at Church Street a lot. I make caramel apples. I made 300 last weekend and 240 this week. And I dip things, and I make marzipan, and so I do all kinds of things. Sometimes I'm working behind the counter. Sometimes I'm making sculptures. Sometimes I'm making apples. So you'll catch me in all different jobs there.
So the sculptures that you make for Champlain Chocolate, do people eat them, or do people get them, or do they just show, or?
Oh, it's the saddest question ever, because they usually make their way to the compost bin afterwards, because they're usually sitting out. They're not in these amazing cases that we have here that we need to buy some of those because they're awesome. Jim's thinking about it. You guys really inspired him. He's like, we need a case. They're exposed, you know, so they get dusty, and it says not to touch them, but people touch them anyway, so. And I usually leave them up. Some I just leave up for a couple months. I have some at the Church Street store. I have one that is 3 years old, still up, totally fine. Would I eat it? No. But I mean, it's not moldy or anything. Like, it really just, dark chocolate has no dairy in it. So essentially it could last forever, really. So there's nothing in it that really spoils in plain dark chocolate. So that's why I like to use it, because it lasts a really long time. You could eat this whole, you can eat that too. No, you can eat that too. I peeled the plastic off. You can eat all of it, except I would not recommend eating the LED lights. Probably not tasty. But you can eat everything else. Yep, totally edible. So you gotta have a big party, and everyone can just break off pieces. I used to do Taekwondo, and I made a sculpture for our Taekwondo Christmas party. It was so cool. One of the black belts got in position, and he punched right through it. It was so cool. It was great. The poor guy really bruised his hand doing it, but it looked really cool, and it shattered into pieces, and everyone just got to eat the pieces afterwards. That was like probably the coolest way to eat a chocolate sculpture. Just punch through it.